Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Protector of the Fairies in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Protector of the Fairies. The echoes of an endless grudge. Yep. Baragan had definitely noticed him. He had really hoped that perhaps Baragan's med state would have resulted in him forgetting a lot, but it seemed his image was burned into that monster's mind. The sheer hate the monster had for him was enough to recognize him, even after losing so much of its reason. He quickly noted Baragan's movements, the magical barrier particles shifting and converging on his position to capture him as if a net was being cast. But with the energy shifted away from Mavis, her connection had never been stronger since they had been separated. Golden light flared to life once more in his right eye, and he saw everything that was about to happen in that next moment. Baragan's attack would encircle him if he was a moment too slow. It would be dangerous to even touch the energy. He couldn't waste a second, which was why he was glad he could correct his movements as he approached. Before him the golden barrier holding Mavis shattered at the front through her will, and she was leaping towards his already extended arm. In one swift move he grabbed her against his chest and let his arm wrap around her, momentarily continuing forward until his feet slammed straight into the other side of the barrier. Then, without wasting a second longer, he applied as much force as he could and kicked back, spinning his body so his gaze rapidly shifted and let him see the fastest path out. Magical barrier particles closed in on each side, but with a few swift moves he broke free before it could finish its encirclement. Ichigo. You really dash. 1 second. He exclaimed to Mavis urgently, backing away rapidly as the energy that had been meant to capture him now blasted out straight at him. As his feet took him off the edge of the tower's roof, he let himself fall rather than sticking to the air, plummeting down towards the ground. Kurosaki. The roar of his name was all the warning given before Baragan's monstrous form threw itself off the edge after him, magical barrier particles gathering and holding its body up in a similar way to the monster's old hollow powers. You really did take your time, Ichigo. Is this really the time for this, Mavis? He asked as he put on a burst of speed, shooting down faster towards the ground. The ground shattered where he landed, and he quickly pushed off from the breaking ground as he darted straight into the streets of the empty city, a wave of magical barrier particles smashing straight where he had been. Kind of a bit preoccupied. Do you know how boring it was waiting in pure darkness? I mean, I guess my barrier gave me some light, but it was pure isolation for days. Oh, left here. You see something? He asked, turning the corner anyway before hearing the sound of a building shattering behind them. I assume that was Dash. The building ahead of us, yes, Mavis said, adjusting his position so that her head was sticking up over his shoulder. Just keep running. You look ahead, I'll look back. Fine with me. Sorry it took so long, by the way, he added, ducking into another street as he noticed a wave of darkness rising up from one side, wide enough that it probably swallowed the whole area not long after he left it. It was hard to track you down. We managed to work out that you were in Alvarez, but Ziref's overzealous precautions forced us to take the long route. Ziref's. He couldn't see what kind of face she was making, but he knew the second she put the dots together from the sound she made. Ah. That tricky bastard. That's cheating. I don't think one can really cheat in war. I don't care. He was pretending to be two different enemies. Thinking you're facing 4 enemies is a hell of a lot more draining than thinking you're facing 3, and you know he did that intentionally. Where is he? I'll give him a piece of my mind. He's back in Ishgar. What? Apparently Acknowledge'a was beginning to make moves. It's why God Serena isn't here either. Mavis was oddly silent for a moment. As he waited, he quickly darted down a main street, kicking back into the sky to get a better look. He could see a trail of destruction across the section of the city he had been sprinting through, the area heavily filled with magical barrier particles with Baragan's form near the center of a growing mass of them. I don't like this. You're telling me, he muttered, carefully watching as Baragan's form moved and revealed a larger body than before, made entirely of bones. He's becoming more and more like his original self. I don't know what is worse, him aging us or him robbing us of our magical power, but a mass of either is going to be difficult to overcome. Especially with his level of control over it. Huh. Mavis turned her head slightly to gaze down at Baragan. Oh yeah, he has become to resemble his old self more. Guess that's good in a way. I saw brief glimpses of him before, but he always looked so different than his normal self. Was more worrying than anything since I didn't know the cause. That's probably a result of the magical barrier particles, he offered up. We believe Avatar's goal was to revive Mimiheiji using a host body, specifically Inukin. Replicating the original fall, or at least the conditions. Smart, I'll give them that. Though hard to say how well it is working. Same. It's no wonder you are not much of a fan of this situation. Oh no, I'm more worried about what Ziraf's up to back on Ishgar. He almost felt the need to glare at her for that. We're facing a potentially world-ending threat and you're worried about Ziraf fighting Aknologia. Ichigo, I'm worried about him after he's finished fighting Aknologia. He loves taking advantage of any opportunity he can get his hands on. When we're done here we'll heading back my way. I doubt he'd expect otherwise, but it's best to not waste a second. And all we have to do is first beat Baragan back into the land of the dead, he muttered back. How hard can it be? See. Think positively, Duck. I know. He roared back as he narrowly dodged the sudden axe swung at him, Baragan having closed the gap much faster than he had initially been prepared for his. His only warning had been the sudden sight in his right eye. Hang on, Mavis. He called out to her as he let himself fall, Baragan not giving chase this time and instead raising his axe up. It didn't look like the monster's usual one, and when it broke apart into magical barrier particles he understood why. The monster's control had already progressed so far that he could compress the energy into physical shapes, and now all that energy was being blasted down at them. It was wide enough that dodging to one side wouldn't clear him from the blast, which left one path. Straight down. Gripping Mavis tightly with one arm, he used his other and quickly brought the golden knife he still held up to his teeth and bit down on it. It was uncomfortably, but it would do for a moment. With his hand now free he reached for the larger form of Zanjutsu from his back and swung it down with his full strength, letting it sail ahead and impale itself into the ground. The energy's catching up. Speed up. He growled out an unrecognizable response as he kicked off against the air, propelling himself down further as he tried to outrace the mass of energy behind him. He had to be quick, else he'd be swallowed up whole the second he landed. With his hand free once more he quickly drew his second blade and repeated the same process as he had with the first, aiming for the first. It slammed point first into the hilt of the other before sinking directly in, responding to his growing magical power as it recognized what he was asking of it. It wouldn't stay like that for long if he didn't manage to reach the blade though. With a final push he managed to hit the ground, pulling the dagger out from between his teeth and slamming it into the side of the fused blade. It, like the other, sunk straight into the sword, the golden markings of the knife spreading across as golden light burst to life from the blade. Bankai! He had never been so glad that his plan had worked, that the three blades would fuse so quickly. The large form of his Bankai's blade quickly greeted him as a wave of magical power tried to blow away the magical barrier particles from above, and failed. The energy was still about to crush him, and would have right until he gripped the hilt of his fused blade tightly and tore it from the ground in one sweep, the ground offering little resistance against his enhanced strength. He almost forgot how drastic the change was, his swing ending a bit later than he planned. Not that it mattered when the combined force of his sudden swing combined with the magical power Mavis provided slammed straight up against the wave of magical barrier particles like a bomb going off. Even with all that, it wasn't enough to disperse all of the energy. Magical barrier particles rained down around him, but he was safe in the epicon tray where his strike had cleared a path straight up to the top. Standing up there he could see Baragan's monstrous form once more, a massive skeletal head peering down at him with one hand outstretched towards him. This looks familiar, he muttered. I think you showed this to me earlier. Did I? Mavis asked curiously. I was just trying to make contact earlier. Didn't really have any idea what you might have been seeing. You saw anything past this point? Not yet. Well, that doesn't mean there isn't anything. Come on, let's kick this monster's butt. We killed him once before, we can do it again. Kurosaki. Die. Kurosaki. Kill. 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 Hopefully before he changes any further, he muttered, Baragan's voice unsettling to his ears. You alright to lend me your strength? It's yours. Just don't let me go, no matter what. I won't this time, he said as he noticed Baragan begin to make his move. Don't worry. So long as you're with me, no one will touch you. He began to shift his grip slightly on his Bankai's blade, doing his best to keep his movements under control so to not release his strike too earlier. Even the simplest of movements tended to have large consequences in this state, and even if he could recover immensely quickly he didn't want to be slow at swinging by even a second. Here we dash. In the end he didn't need to make the first move. He'd been so focused on running, and Baragan had been so focused on chasing, that they had all forgotten one important fact. He wasn't alone here. Right as Baragan began to try and descend towards him, bringing with him a mass of magical barrier particles, an arrow 3 times larger than the monster's whole body had slammed straight into him, sending him flying into the distance and causing the magical barrier particles around them to halt briefly. He wasted no time taking advantage of that, leaping upwards in a single burst and clearing the hole now present to reach the wide open spaces of the sky. As he came to a slow stop up at the clouds, he noticed the fading form of a giant bow of energy from the original point of the fight, confirming his suspicions of who had just fired that arrow. Stay on guard, Ichibe said as he appeared next to him, his odd brush weapon resting against his shoulders. We're moving to pursue Baragan while we have the advantage. Warod is already moving to try and immobilize him for us to move in. We got a plan. Strike as hard as we can until we kill him. Simple, but right now likely the most effective one we have. Protector of the Fairies. This place is so sad, Warod muttered to himself as he followed after the path Baragan had been flung across. So little wishes to grow. It was the sad reality faced by the sheer amount of magical barrier particles present. The very life around them had been brought to an end as the magic that sustained it was torn away, destroyed in the constant clash. For someone as close with nature as himself, the emptiness he felt as he tried to reach out to his surroundings was unheard of. Even in the desert life could be found, managing to survive through even those harsh conditions. But here there was nothing, not even the sound of the wind to keep him company. Whether it was because of their constant proximity to Baragan so far or just from being surrounded by magical barrier particles for so long, it was getting harder and harder to breathe. Pain had already been a constant reminder of the place they had stepped foot into, a realm not meant for those who used magic, and it appeared like it was only going to get worse as their bodies began to struggle to handle the poisonous air. Some of them were definitely feeling it worse than others though. He doubted Ichigo or the Celestial Spirit King would have noticed the change yet, neither having been near Baragan for long enough, and some like Waiwak and Aoesu, and maybe even Ichibe, had survived through very standard methods of immortality. Simply extended lifespans, or at least he assumed that was the general case. For him and Hibarian, things would only get trickier. He was old. Old enough that his flesh had begun to fail him until magic found a way to keep him sustained through his magic. The result was the being he was now, part human where it mattered but with flesh that was far more organic than most truly realized. His body was sustained by magic and sunlight, with the former playing a huge role, and he could feel the strain his body was being put under now that the former source was being heavily limited and eaten away at. Hibarian was stuck in a similar boat. The man never liked to talk about how he found his method of immortality, but one thing had stuck that he had told them. Hibarian had seen death itself. Had experienced it. And then he'd come back, not something that one could truly call human anymore. Like himself, he assumed magic played a heavy role in sustaining Hibarian's immortality and would have far greater consequences if that connection was severed through any means. Given enough time, either of them could die in this fight just through prolonged exposure. It was a reality he was slowly having to accept, and immediately try and figure out ways to counter it. His death. Well, he could accept it if need be. But Hibarian was necessary if they wanted to have a chance to deal with Waiwak afterwards. The very fact they had managed to get Hibarian's blood into food he had eaten with them was a miracle in itself, but if Hibarian died then that chance would be wasted. Speaking of the man in question. Baragan landed this way right? He asked, calling out Hibarian as the man spirited along beside him, keeping pace with the large plant route he had created to ride along. There were times he wished he was capable of similar feats of physical strength and speed, but they all had their own talents. His had never needed to be in such areas, Not when Yuri had always been there ahead of him and prepped to allow them to support with large-scale magic from the rear. I haven't seen him make any moves to leave or attack yet. He's definitely there, Hyborian answered, warily watching out for any signs of a trap as they drew nearer. Though I'll admit that his lack of action is concerning. Especially after his brief encounter with Ichigo. It definitely reawoke something in him, Warod said in agreement. Or rather brought what was still there up to the surface. But if it did, why has he not made any moves to charge back in yet? Perhaps he's forgotten, Hyborian offered cautiously, unsure of his own answer. Baragan is not in the same state he was once in. We have no idea how much was damaged through this bastardist version of resurrection. Perhaps he simply doesn't have the mental facilities to hold on to short-term memories. He remembers that he hates Ichigo, but has forgotten that he is here. Barely a minute has passed. I know. But if his mind was damaged, perhaps he cannot hold on to short-term memories. But his hatred of Ichigo? That's long-term, infecting most of his original memories, I reckon. Even if he lost the majority of them, they'd be enough to still hold on to that single emotion. Likely enough to recognize his hated foe based on what we have seen, but only when Ichigo is there to fill in that blank spot in his mind. Then is it really wise to have him involved in this fight? Warod asked, altering the path of the growing tree and causing its branches to spread out at either side. They would continue to charge forward, but they couldn't risk Baragan running. It would take more out of him than he was used to in this current environment, but he could still create a new forest for Hyborian and himself to use to their advantage. If he doesn't see Ichigo, he might be more docile. Maybe, Hyborian conceded. But we weren't getting anywhere before. We won't get anywhere if something doesn't change. And when Baragan saw Ichigo, what did he do? He ignored all of us, abandoned all caution, and tried to chase him down like a madman. If seeing Ichigo makes him more dangerous, it also makes him more careless. And besides, Hyborian added after a moment of thought. Do either of us even have the raw power to break through Baragan's magical barrier particles? You can restrain him, smash trees into him, but in the end he eats away at your magic too quickly. Meanwhile I can't close the distance fast enough so long as he has a shield of magical barrier particles, making my strength useless and my blood ineffective if I can't get close enough. Ichigo though can take on Baragan's attacks head-on, especially so now that he has Mavis. Something like that can give us the opening we need. I hope you'll write about this, Warod muttered. Alright then. Let's take this slowly until Ichigo shows up and draws Baragan's attention. We don't want any of us to dash. Kurosaki. Warod felt his blood go cold as Baragan's face suddenly appeared mere inches away from him. He stumbled back hastily, instantly stopping the wood beneath his feet so to not get dragged forward into the waiting arms of the monster before him, and in the process stumbled a few times and almost fell. Fast. He hadn't been aware Baragan could move that fast. The only moment Baragan had shown anything like that had been, well, when he had seen Ichigo. Kurosaki? Kuro-saki. There wasn't any humanity left in that face either, completely reverted back to the skeletal skull of the monster's original hollow form. Some of the magical barrier particles had solidified into a tattered cloak of sorts, energy leaking from its ends, and he could see that the rest of the monster's body had also reverted to bones. It didn't help that the form of Baragan right now was extremely large, nor that the cloak ended below his waist and only magical barrier particles continued down from there, spreading out the energy all around them even now. The growing trees he was trying to make closest to Baragan were simply withering up and dying as the energy reached out and touched them. What was most terrifying was those eyes though. The empty blank slots on the skull, as if there was nothing but an endless void in there, inviting him to take a step closer and sink into the abyss. He forever to even breathe for a moment, and might have even forgotten to move until it was too late. But then Baragan turned his head away and suddenly the fear was gone. Instead that monster's gaze was looking at Hyborian, and he noticed one of the giant skeletal arms pressing down heavily on the decaying wood before pushing forth of it. Immediately the source of that sudden burst of speed revealed itself when Hyborian had to leap away, barely avoiding the other arm of Baragan's. At first glance it looked like he was being attacked, but after realizing Baragan had ignored him and gone after Hyborian he realized it was anything but that. Baragan wasn't attacking them. He was examining them. Hyborian's words had more weight all of a sudden. Even if it had only been a single word, he'd heard the tone when it had been asked. Baragan had been looking at him trying to work out if he was Kurosaki. Perhaps it was the fact that they approached Baragan while the knowledge was still so fresh, enough to remember that Ichigo was here but not enough to properly remember which of them Ichigo was. So now he was looking at them in turn, trying to piece it together. Baragan had obviously realized enough to know that he wasn't Ichigo, but since he was still trying to grab Hyborian, the man quickly using the newly grown trees that had yet to decay from Baragan's power, to outmaneuver the monster's larger and less wieldy form. But that would only last so long when all Hyborian could do is run. How far were the others? He could sense them moving, but being this close to Baragan was distorting his senses. What he needed was a way to alert them now. But what? Throw a tree? Oh wait. That was what he was good at, wasn't it? Hyborian. Get over here and grab on. He didn't have time to check to see if Hyborian heard his warning or not. Grabbing all the seeds he still had on him, he scattered them all across the ground beneath his palm before slamming his hand down on them, pouring forth all the magic he could as quickly as he could. The earth began to rumble, shaking as if an earthquake was going off nearby, before it shattered entirely as all the roots from the seeds beneath him intertwined together and feed of his magic to grow in size. In mere moments he was being flung upwards, the largest tree he had made in some time continuing to grow out in all directions. Its trunk widened to support its growth as its height increased dramatically, pulling him up higher and higher towards the clouds. Branches sprung out from all sides in response, growing larger and larger the nearer to the top they got. He's following us. He heard Hyborian call out, much to his relief since it meant that he was still keeping up. Got any bright ideas? Only one. He called back, steadying his stance as he looked down and watched Baragan's form being lifted up by magical barrier particles as he gave chase after Hyborian, the man using the growing branches to fling himself clockwise around the tree as it grew higher and higher, occasionally dropping down when Baragan got too close and reversing his direction for a bit. Taking his gaze off Hyborian, he turned his head towards the figures he could clearly see in the sky before hastily shouting out a warning. Dodge! Dodge? Why do I dash? Aw crap! That bastard! Hyborian roared, obviously seeing the same thing before kicking off a large branch and diving down towards the ground. Baragan made to give chase before suddenly bringing his arm up, just in time to catch a massive arrow of energy by the arrowhead before it exploded against him and forced his magical barrier particles to act to defend himself. Warod! Off the tree now! He didn't have to think twice upon hearing Aoyasu's voice, making a leap of faith downwards in the opposite path of Baragan. On his way down he noticed the blacksmith clearly, his sword held back with a smirk on his face that he was sending up at him. Sorry to ruin your work like this. He called out before swinging. No matter how thick the tree was, nor how strong the bark was, it made no difference. Before that blade, it could put up no resistance. From the look of Aoyasu he wasn't even sure if the man had really had to put much effort into his swing. The sword was so sharp that it cut cleanly through even a tree this large with a single swing, without him having to do anything more to help it. All right. Your turn. Aoyasu called back as the tree began to fall. Suddenly Ichigo was there, his sword slamming into the top of the tree before he swung over it and brought his feet down against the bark. Ichigo was lucky the top of the tree didn't just shatter when he slammed against it, but it managed to hold itself together, long enough for all that momentum to immediately increase its speed. Baragan had only a moment to turn to see the sight in time before the massive trunk of the tree slammed straight into him and forced him into the ground. All of you back! Whack called out, Ichigo having retreated the moment the tree had slammed against the ground. Arrows the size of blades slammed into the ground all around the tree, light darting from each before he realized they were forming a barrier. Magic swarmed up, racing to complete itself even as magical barrier particles leaking out from beneath the wood and tried to break free first, but they were too slow. The last bit of light reached the top, and with it the barrier completed itself. Still, he had no illusions about how long it would hold. No matter how strong the barrier was, he couldn't forget that magical barrier particles had penetrated the massive barrier around Ishgar's forces, based off Mavis's own impenetrable barrier. A barrier made by Wiwak would be strong, but it would only last minutes at best. And worse, seconds. It was a shame he wasn't even surprised when it did shatter those few seconds later, a massive surge of magical barrier particles breaking holes in all directions and eroding the wood away that had pinned Baragan's form down. The giant skeletal form pushed itself back up, its head slowly looking round before it finally settled its gaze on Ichigo. "Kurosaki." "Didn't even take a second to recognize him," he muttered. "Let's hope he really does get as careless as you said he would." Hibarian. Protector of the Fairies. Left. "I told you I see it," Ichigo shot back, narrowly dodging the large edge of magical barrier particles made from one of Baragan's newly made axes. They weren't the most durable, but every time he broke one all it did was release the energy into the air as a poison mist while a new one formed in its place. It was much easier to deal with them by merely dodging, but that was easier said than done, even with his speed. It would be easy to just fall back and outrun Baragan at full speed in his Bankai. But if he did... Ichigo. "Keep him here." He scowled, adjusting the pressure he was putting on his left leg before leaping back with the adjusted amount, just enough so that he could dodge the wave of energy swung at him from Baragan and give himself space to unleash a blast of magic of his own to retaliate. Baragan burst through the wave of magic, energy going wild around him, only to have to immediately swing out with his axe at someone else that wasn't him when Hibarian leapt down from above. The man almost got sliced in half if not for the fact that the blood the man had purposefully spilled from his body was able to solidify briefly and let him leap back away. Stuff like this was the reason he couldn't retreat that far back. He could put miles between him and Baragan without even trying, but the moment he did that Baragan would pursue him endlessly like before. For some they might be able to try and keep out with Baragan, but not all of them were fast enough for that. They'd enviably be left behind, reducing their numbers temporarily. If he was merely running, that wouldn't be a problem normally. But when he had to fight, doing so alone was the worst thing he could do. With Mavis's assistance he could compete evenly even against the magical barrier particles, able to wipe them out through sheer power. But the longer they thought, the more that energy would begin to run out and the more Baragans would grow. Even now the monster's power was growing, magical barrier particles forming in greater amounts each and every time Baragan needed more. All Baragan had to do is turn the fight into a stalemate and it would eventually end in his win. Running wouldn't work, nor would fighting alone. The one advantage of fighting Baragan like this meant he was all Baragan. It was like the monster forget entirely that there were others here, right until they tried to strike. They hadn't had much luck so far, but they were getting there. But that would only be possible so long as he kept Baragan near where they could strike from. And that was why fighting like this was so trickier. Backing away too far would only encourage Baragan to give chase. Not retreating back far enough would end up with him being hit by magical barrier particles, and if that happened his regeneration would be extremely slow to recover, even with Mavis helping to sustain him. With both options bad, he had to force himself to keep his speed and strength under control, and he had never been more thankful for Mavis's power flowing through him and letting him glimpse into the future. Without it he was sure he would have messed up so many times by now, since even with it he was finding this difficult. Swinging up, he unleashed a wave of magic from his sword once more as he forced Baragan back further, quickly stepping in to follow it up with another swing. His sword met Baragan's axe and for a moment he felt his sword shake, the coating of magic around his blade almost failing entirely as Baragan's axe tried to cut through it. Before it could, the Celestial Spirit King was there to force Baragan back. Coming down from above, like a comet falling to earth, the giant slammed his sword point first down at Baragan, the monster narrowly dodging as the blade sunk into the ground. It did nothing to stop the energy that exploded outwards, space distorting briefly as cracks spread out through the crack before all the energy shot outwards. Even Baragan's magical barrier particles weren't enough to completely protect him, throwing him back and removing most of the energy at the front of his body. Stuff like that was changes they all waited for. But it still wasn't enough. Moving faster than anyone else, he leapt out of the newly made crater, landing briefly on the Celestial Spirit King's shoulder and kicking back off. He didn't have time to apologize as he knocked the giant back away from them, knowing he had to close the gap as quickly possible. His sword swung and... Kurosaki. Yeah, he couldn't catch a break. Faster than before, Even more magical barrier particles leaked out from Baragan's body, as if escaping through the growing cracks along his body. He hadn't had time to think on whether they were a good or bad thing when they were helping to fuel the monster's strength, so instead all he could focus on was dodging as all the newly gathered energy, along with Baragan's existing energy, shot forward at him like a typhoon. "I've got this," Mavis said to him before he could begin to move, moving one hand from her tight grip on him to extend it out towards the energy. Golden light shone from her palm before forming the familiar sight of fairy sphere, only half complete but large enough to form a large barrier in front of them. "Just focusing on attacking," Mavis said to him as he tightened his grip on her with his left hand. Wielding his Bankai's large blade with one hand was sometimes more difficult than he'd like, but with the speed and strength he had he could make up for any shortcomings. It was more dangerous to risk her falling at these speeds if he wasn't holding onto her. "I'll handle the defense when things get too much." "This only does so much," he replied, noticing how the shield was already starting to gain cracks along it. So long as Fairy Sphere wasn't complete, it couldn't bring out its full defensive abilities. But so long as it was complete, he'd be unable to move quickly to escape and Baragan could just encircle him. "One of you mind doing something? You should learn to be more patient," called out Wywak from above, hundreds of blades made of energy forming in the air around him. "I'll be borrowing an old technique of yours, Ichigo. It's much easier to break through this energy if it takes more than a few seconds to be eaten away at." Without even a wave of his hand or a noticeable signal, Wywak sent the hundreds of blades down upon Baragan, creating a rain of magical made steel. Realizing the danger, Baragan responded in kind, bringing his arm around and turning all the energy that had been pinning him down to protect himself once more. A large chunk of the energy shot upwards to meet the blades, leaving holes in the energy closer to his body that had yet to be covered. Aoyasu struck in that moment, slipping beneath the wave of deadly energy and letting his sword sink low with him as it sliced through the ground. Pulling his body up as he came out from beneath the magical barrier particles, he wasted no time in swinging, his blade slicing through the gap in Baragan's defenses and taking off the monster's left arm. If it hurt, Baragan didn't show any indication of that. Instead he swung his remaining arm as fast as he could, the axe prepared to crush Aoyasu where he stood. He didn't let that happen. Kicking off from the ground, he darted around the remaining magical barrier particles in his path before swinging his own blade up as he leapt across the last distance between them. In his haste, however, he forgot to hold back, and his blow sent Baragan flying across into the distance. "Aw crap! Hold on!" Without waiting to hear their responses, he speed after Baragan, passing the monster with ease before quickly reversing his direction and swinging back at Baragan. The monster was fast enough to have recovered in time, enough that his sword met a wave of magical barrier particles, but the force was enough to send Baragan right back the way he had come. It wasn't as far as he liked, only causing him to be sent flying halfway back, but it was enough that the others would reach them soon. He was prepared to charge right back in to keep Baragan there when a voice spoke to him in his head. "Ichigo. Stay back. You making a move, Ichibe?" he asked. "If I don't move soon, he'll chase back after me. Don't worry. I have taken care of that." A word appeared in the air before him, and it would have made him dart back if not for the fact he had seen it happen a second earlier and recognized the style. "I have hidden you briefly and disguised my appearance. To Baragan's eyes, I appear to be you." He glanced over towards Baragan, spotting Ichibe landing close to Baragan and seeing how the monster turned his head towards the monk. Was that how Baragan's hatred looked from the outside, he wondered as Baragan leapt towards Ichibe without care for his own safety? No wonder the others wanted to take advantage of that so much. "Hang on a moment," Ichibe said, raising his hand back before a giant version of it made from his own magic formed in the air. Senritsu Utenshou. One moment Baragan was there, the next he had been flung into the distance, almost out of sight. "Impressive," he heard Ichibe said, the voice leaving his mind as the monk moved closer to him so they could speak more freely. "That should have sent him much further. His resistance to magic has grown significantly over this fight. Was that technique your plan?" "Oh no," the monk said before the look on his face changed. It almost made Ichigo raise his own blade warily at him, seeing the cheerful look turn into one of a remorseless killer with a wide smile on his face. "This will do it. All of you stay back." He glanced around briefly, Realizing Wywak and the Celestial Spirit King had managed to close the distance by this point, watching warily themselves from the sky. His eyes quickly turned back to Ichibe though, even as Baragan was rushing back in. "Good, all of you stay there. You should not come closer, else I might kill you all by accident," Ichibe said, swinging his brush around and causing darkness to be drawn from all directions. Wait, it wasn't just darkness. Anything that was black was being taken, the color itself being stolen from his Zanpakuto blade and anything he had of the color, and it was the same for everyone else and all of their surroundings. Even the magical barrier particles themselves seemed to flicker slightly, as if struggling to keep their color. Tricky like always. But the fact I can take even the slightest bit of darkness from you means you are a far cry from Mimi Heiji, Ichibe said, the darkness collecting into a sake cup that he held in his other hand. Never mind. I can get the rest I need with this alone. O twilight, and everlasting darkness, come to me, come and have a drink, and once you do, your life will fade. Raising the cup, he downed the contents in one go before throwing the cup away to one side, swinging his Zanpakuto a few times and causing ink to splatter everywhere as he continued to chant. The flowers will bloom along the road to hell. Where are the fish? Let me paint them black, cut them into 8, and cook them well atop a flame of black, and then enjoy the meal. Hurry! He's almost here. He called out in warning, but Ichibe paid him little heed, instead continuing with the spell he was casting. All that's left are bones of white, make them a gravestone, and pay respect, Ichibe said as he slammed the blade end of his brush into the ground. All around him the darkness he had gathered with each swing rose up, a large mausoleum now standing at his back while around him stood shattered gravestones. May they never be reborn again, so that you won't be sacrificed as food. Letting out a sigh, Ichibe glanced at the closing Baragan. A shame that this is the only way you can be put to rest. But your soul can never be allowed to continue beyond this point. Futentai Satsuryu. Unaware of the threat, or perhaps uncaring, Baragan took a step into the field of darkness as he raised his axe up high. In turn Ichibe pulled his Zanpakuto from the ground and swung, darkness consuming the two of them entirely. It stayed like that long enough for Warod and the others to catch up to them, and eventually Ichibe himself finally showed up as he stepped out of the darkness. It appears we may have some bright nights ahead of us for the next year, Ichibe stated, glancing back at the lingering darkness with worry. I had to steal a lot to make up for the lack of power I couldn't muster from the environment, and it would have been more if this had been Mimi Heiji himself. Is it enough? He found himself asking, watching the darkness warily. Did that finish Baragan off? I don't know yet, Ichibe replied, backing away from the darkness sensibly as he watched for any movement. This technique takes away all the darkness in an individual, including in their flesh, blood, and bones, and does so until nothing is left. Their destruction is so absolute that not even their soul remains. It has been a means I have had to use to wipe away troublesome individuals in the long-forgotten past, and one I have never been looking forward to using again. But for some individuals, there is no other way. We cannot take the risk of Baragan being revived again by any remains of Avatar. Can it break through his magical barrier particles? It has before, but Baragan is the closest anyone has ever been to Mimi Heiji to my knowledge. Whether I can steal enough darkness to overpower his magical barrier particles is a question. Ah. It didn't work, I'm afraid. The darkness scattered out in all directions, Baragan standing in the center with a mass of magical barrier particles lashing out in all directions like whips. His body looked far worse for wear though, only his skull present and even that had been eroded away. So close, Ichibe muttered. A bit longer and he would have been consumed. Be careful. He's trying something. Indeed Baragan was. Magical barrier particles were swarming out from his skull in all directions, and more was being drawn from all around them where they had been scattered during Baragan's time here. Like the winds of a typhoon they circled them, trapping them in the eye of the storm as it began to close and the energy from within began to expand. Ichigo. Celestial Spirit King. Cut us open a path. Wywak called out rapidly, forming dozens of arrows rapidly and firing them merely to keep Baragan focused on defending himself rather than advancing. If we don't cut a way out of here we'll. No. It's now. The future of darkness is now. Now. Then didn't that mean that it was merely because Wywak didn't see past this point? That meant they either won now, or they died. In which case they needed to do everything they could here and now. He could tell Mavis shared his opinion when he felt her hastily shoving as much magical power to him as she could, forgetting about what happened to his arm last time she did that. It wouldn't matter though if they didn't survive past this moment. All he had to think about for this moment was swinging his sword. He would have done just that, if not for the fact Baragan's skull shattered into a million pieces before he could. And as it did, he felt all the magic of the world scream out in pain. And then be silenced. Protector of the fairies. A broken world that only one desired. Every creature in the world must have sensed it at that same moment. The moment when all things came to an end. The sound of the sea came to a halt as the waves became still. The winds of the sky stopped moving, not even the gentlest of breezes able to be felt nor the most vicious of storms. The leaves of trees fell one by one, as if winter had come suddenly and they were hurrying to catch up. The earth rumbled once before quieting permanently, and across all the lands of the world a foreboding silence fell upon the earth. Some thought it wouldn't last. Some thought it was a trick. But no matter who it was, no matter how far away they were, they all felt the same thing. All except those blessed enough to have been able to use magic in their lifetime. And for those individuals, what they could perceive was far worse. To a mage, they knew how important magic was to life. It was found in all things, from the smallest and most insignificant of organisms to the mighty dragons and gods of legends. All things that moved, breathed, lived, possessed that same spark in some form, regardless of how much magical power they could call upon or whether they even held the ability to tap into it in the first place. And when the world grew still, they all heard it. As the earth trembled, they heard it cry. A voice reserved only for a select few, those granted extraordinary abilities of its power or sight, could be heard for the first time since eons ago. A voice that couldn't truly be described and only perceived, but one in which no one could mishear or misunderstand its words or intentions. Its voice was heard for only a second. A single second that, to many, felt far longer. To those that understood the weight of it, it felt even longer. And then that voice was silenced. Not even a whisper was left behind to even hint that anything had ever been heard in the first place. But the fact it had been heard had been enough. As quickly as the voice had been heard and silenced, an emptiness fell across the world. The very essence of life vanished, in but that single moment, and a new presence replaced it. A presence of the foulest kind to those that had tasted even the touch of magic in their life. To the mages of the world, nothing could be felt. Nothing could be sensed. Even those with large quantities of magical power found that strength stripped of them in mere moments, reduced to children crawling on the ground and trying to find the strength to breath, let alone stand. The land itself became a world where nothing was allowed to exist. And in that land, a single figure took a step forward with a smile across his face. Protector of the fairies. Is everyone okay? Mavis asked, one hand shakily glowing with dim golden light as she struggled to keep the barriers in place around each of them. Did I make it? Her grip slipped off Ichigo and she began to fall, being caught by him right before she could make contact. Ah, thanks. You don't look so good there, Mavis. I don't feel so good, she muttered weakly, reaching up and gripping him tightly for support. I'm so tired. Resist that urge if you can, the Celestial Spirit King's booming voice stated, the giant cradling his sword against his shoulder as he rested a hand against the lacrima encased in the hilt. That's what Zera's trying to say. I think. She retreated back into her housing. I see, Ichibe stated from his position, glancing between the Celestial Spirit King and Mavis. I can understand why. For a being who projects an image of herself into the world, doing so in this current situation must be hellish. The same can be said for you, Mavis. Take down the barriers, otherwise you'll just exhaust yourself further. Just hang on a moment. The light dimmed before it was finally extinguished, much to her surprise as the barriers shattered all around them. Or not. Guess they were more damaged than they looked. They were lucky to hold up at all. How much magic do you have left? About. Mavis paused briefly, her brow furrowing as she tried to focus on putting a number to the amount she had left. Ah. This is difficult. Don't remember ever being this low before. I'll put this in a better way then. How far back in time do you think you could go with the magic you have left? About a week if I'm lucky, Mavis stated without hesitation, only realizing the implications of that right after saying it. Oh. That's low. I mean by human standards it's got to still be ridiculous, but for me. I doubt many of us would expect anything less from Lumen Histo-Ire, Wywak stated over his shoulder, not even bothering to spare a glance at any of them and instead focusing on the area where Baragan had been at. At full capacity, you should be capable of thousands of years with ease. I can go further than that in one jump I think. My point stands. And even after a constant barrage from Baragan and magical barrier particles before then, you held out with a large chunk of magical power still remaining, enough to throw it around with ease. Let's say you had enough magic left to travel a few hundred years under your own power. Which means whatever just happened was enough to take what could have allowed you to travel centuries and instead drained it to mere days. That is how much force hit all of the barriers you threw up in time. It wasn't an attack of magic, Warod said, speaking up as he removed a hand from the ground, momentarily glancing at it in worry before turning his focus back on them. This land was already desolate thanks to Baragan's rampage, but I could still sense things beyond this land, even if only faintly. All of that is gone now. Warod's right, said Awesu, holding a hand up to the air before flinching at the touch of the dark particles floating through the air instead of the familiar ones they were all used to. I don't know about you, but I think the world seems a bit quieter than it should be. Can't you all tell? Something is missing. Why don't we ask the one who claimed to see this coming, Hyberion declared, turning their attention towards Wywak who was still busy examining where Baragan had been. Well, Quincy King? You going to say anything? It's laughable that you think I did this, Wywak stated coldly, his gaze never shifting to them once. Unfortunately this was not a part of any plan of mine. I did not wish for magic to be gone, and I spent as long as I could trying to pinpoint the cause. This was it. Or rather it should have been. Did we fail to kill Baragan in time? Ichigo asked worriedly, glancing at where Baragan had been before the monster had broken apart into magical barrier particles. Because if we were too late, surely Mimiheiji should have formed. Did he somehow cause this but fail to manifest? Not possible, Ichibe stated seriously. A failed manifestation, even if the one involved was Nukin, should not have resulted in this catastrophe. But for that same matter, not even Mimiheiji himself should have been able to cause this with his manifestation. You're sure on that? The Celestial Spirit King asked. I'm afraid my knowledge is likely lacking in this area compared to the rest of you, but are you sure that his summoning wouldn't cause this? Absolutely, Ichibe replied without hesitation. Mimiheiji is dangerous. More so than anyone else in the entire world, for the mere fact that his presence erodes away at magic. But that's just it. It erodes away at it. At the same time, magic erodes back. There is no doubt that Mimihagi's manifestation would cause a large area of land to instantly be stripped of the magic within, but beyond that any more should take time. It would never be this instantaneous. But what bothers me the most is why he didn't manifest. The conditions were all met, and even weakened Baragan's body could have still provided a subtle host, even if only for a short while. So why ignore this chance? I made a mistake, Wywak suddenly said, causing all eyes to snap towards him as the Quincy King turned to face them. The many pupils visible in his undamaged eyes showed he wasn't clearly seeing them, but rather what was in the future for them all, but after a few moments even that returned to its normal state. I saw too much. I made an assumption, a conclusion, and mistook it for truth. You saw wrong. Wywak shook his head gravely. No. My sight was perfect. Coming here was necessary to stop the end. In all possible futures that I examined, everything revealed that the end would originate here. That was what I believed. But I was wrong. No, I was led to be wrong. Lead. Warod muttered in horror. Don't tell me. Your own sight was predicted? In all the infinite number of futures. I see from the perspective of my own eye in that point in the future, Wywak revealed. I checked thousands of places throughout all those possible futures. All of them showed the same thing. The darkness at the end of my visions that I could not, and still cannot, perceive past. The only sign of magical barrier particles was here, and so naturally I would make for this place. With you all in tow to fight this battle. But my mistake was assuming there was a single player in this game. I was wrong. There are no other Ukin that Mimi Heiji could manifest into, Ichibe stated. If there were, we would all know about it. There doesn't need to be. We were all so focused on the threat of Mimi Heiji being formed that we forgot its goal. Why does it need to manifest for its goal to be fulfilled? It doesn't. In all the futures where we didn't go to face Baragan, it's likely Mimi Heiji manifested and caused a chain of events that ended the world, or at least cut off my vision from the future. And in all the futures where we did go to face him, the same event occurred. Which means the event itself that caused this may not have been Mimi Heiji itself, is that what you're saying? Hibarian asked. In which case, does that mean the entire objective was to get us out of the way? Either by being unable to stop Mimi Hagi's manifestation or by being too far away to stop whatever event another triggered. It's possible. Could it have been Avatar? Could they have kept something back? A doomsday weapon of some kind from a bygone era? But why didn't Pernida act? He should have been able to. Never mind all of that now, said Aoesu. What do we do now? I doubt the enemy expects us to have a do-over like Mavis over there. They've countered me, Wywak stated. But you may have a point. It is far easier to manipulate the future than it is to even account for the past causing alterations. We could travel back a week right now, but we'd have no idea of the source, and only a week to find it, finished the Celestial Spirit King for him. And we'd have the entire world to search in that time, unable to count on your eyes, alongside alerting the enemy to our intentions. And during that time we cannot ignore the danger Baragan could possess, or any other traps prepared for us. We cannot travel back until we can at least narrow down the source. In which case, I suggest we head in the direction of the foulest sensation, said Warad, glancing towards the direction with a frown. It seems far, and going that way. Considering distance too. Ishgar. No, Fiori, Hibarian stated. It's too far for us to reach even we sensed anything afoot. And now we need to make it there with only the magic we have left. It'll degrade too, Aoesu pointed out. Luckily those barriers protected us, else I'm not sure we'd have anything left. I'm sure we can try and stop the leakage of our magical power, but getting to Ishgar in our condition, that's going to be tough. And if we take too long, going back 7 days won't matter. It'll likely end up being less in this poisonous atmosphere, Mavis stated. You think it's hard for you to try and hold on to magic, try being me. I'll do my best and try and reduce my losses, but for every day that passes, I'll end up losing one too. We take more than 3 days to get answers and I won't be able to take us back to before all of this happened. We can make it in 3 days, Warad stated. But not all of us will. If I use up all the magical power I have right now, I can get us to the coast by nightfall. That will give you all 2.5 days to cross the ocean somehow and find any clues you can. Warad. If you do that, you'll die. I'm already dying, Warad said with a sad smile, showing her his hand and how it was slowly withering away. You all must have realized it to some degree. Without the rich amount of magic in the air for our bodies to absorb, our immortalities have stopped. For some I doubt the difference is noticeable yet, but for me whose life is maintained only through my magic. Even if I conserve my energy, my body will fail. A day at best, hours at worst. You're leaving too, I see, Mavis muttered softly, gesturing for Ichigo to carry her forward and bring her closer to her old friend. Leaning forward as she neared the old mage, she left a kiss atop his head before pulling him into a hug. First Yuri, then pricked for as temporary as it was. And now you. I knew this would happen when I first met you all. It didn't mean I would enjoy it. Oh come now Mavis, cheer up, Warad said, putting on a smile as she pulled away from him. Change things and I won't have a reason to kick the bucket just yet. I'll only be gone for a while, but being who you are I know we'll meet again. I will. But you won't. For this will always be the end. Then I'm happy that I can at least see my friends off. Besides, if I have to go then I'd rather ensure you can see me again than this all being for nothing. It won't be, right? Of course not, Mavis replied, putting on a smile of her own. We'll find a way. No matter what. That's all I needed to hear. Turning to the others, Warod lifted his cane before slamming it against the ground. I will do my best to get you as close as I can, but at this distance it may be hard to judge distance or even determine if my magic will last. The only warning I can give you is to hold on, as I won't be able to catch any of you if you fall off. You sure you'll have enough vegetation to do this? Hyborian asked in concern. I know how this magic of yours works, and in this land right now. Don't worry, Warod said, placing a hand against his chest with a pulling part of his robe back to reveal the wood flesh beneath. I have all the fuel I need right here. If the land itself cannot provide me what I need, then the only choice left is to use my own body as the catalyst. Protector of the fairies. In the end, Warod's magic withered away before they managed to reach the sea. All had seemed fine for a time, but eventually the plant carrying them forth simply collapsed down into the ground before it too began to decay. By the time they began to reach the sea, night had long since passed and the sun had begun to rise once more. With one day already spent, they had discussed in depth how to cross the sea in the fastest possible time while keeping in mind the magic they had left. The world as it was presented too many challenges they found. Their magical power couldn't replenish with the absence of magic in the air, so time was already against them. For some, crossing the sea should have been easy normally. Platforms of magic could be formed beneath the sole of their feet and they could traverse the ocean far above it at high speeds. But while such a method was still available, its viability was called into question countless times. Forming a platform was easy. Forming one that wouldn't be eroded away immediately by the magical barrier particles in the air was another matter entirely. Forming a stable platform to push off from required more magic to be expended to hold back the platform's destruction, which meant reducing their energy at a far faster rate without any way to replenish it. Doing the whole process to cross an ocean as vast as this one. They would have been lucky to make it halfway before their magic ran out entirely. Normal transport, however, looked entirely unusable. The winds wouldn't pick up for the ship they had left behind no matter what they tried. At best they could simulate it through fast physical strikes, but that would also burn through their energy at an alarming rate, even for those that could compress their energy down to try and reduce the loss. It had been then, in their uncertainty, that the Celestial Spirit King had offered a solution. That was why, right now, they were hanging on at different points of the giant's armor, trying not to fall off as they were carried across the ocean. Out of all of them, the Celestial Spirit King was the only one who believed he could make the journey, being capable of flying more easily thanks to his magic, and was large enough to carry them all. But they knew that once they made it, he would be unable to follow. They had long since passed the halfway mark, and at this point all he had left to rely on was remaining magic Zero was offering him. At their current pace, Ichigo was sure they'd arrive at land once again a few hours before dawn. That would still only leave them with a day and a half at best, and really it would be better to leave earlier to allow for more time once they reached the past. And as it stood currently, he wasn't liking their current trend to make progress. To make progress, they had to lose another of their numbers. It was not something he was fond of, especially when he knew he could do nothing to help ease the burden. The offers he had made when they had tried to find solutions to crossing the ocean had all been dismissed for a single reason. Mavis. It was true that she had the power to take them back. But he was her partner. She had agreed as much, staring intently at Wywak as she did, that she had no intention of allowing her power to be used if he wasn't with her. It did guarantee that Wywak wouldn't try anything, at least, knowing he certainly would not have enough time to learn how to utilize her power, especially when he would likely lose too much magic to even make use of it, but there was still the worry of what would come after they traveled back. Ichigo. Can you hear me? Yeah, I can, he spoke back within his mind, answering the voice of Ichibe as it made itself known. I hope this is worth the loss of magic. It is. I had to make sure we could not be overheard. By Wywak, I assume. Of course. He sighed quietly to himself, not daring to look away from anywhere but the horizon ahead in case anything could catch Wywak's attention. You sure he won't notice the magic you're using? My magic is not so easily detected, but I had taken precautions. The Celestial Spirit King's own magic is proving to be a useful tool to hide behind, and I don't know when I'll next get this chance to speak to you without him noticing. Still, let's not risk this going on for too long. Can you be quick? I'll try. Mavis should be able to hear me too. Yeah, I can hear you, Mavis replied. She still sounded weak to his mind, but she was able to hide it better when speaking like this. This about the plan. About Lumen Histoire. Ah. So you've got concerns of your own. A few, Mavis replied calmly. If we're being honest, I'm still not sure on how far I can get everyone back. I'm aware. That estimate of yours wasn't including us, was it? It wasn't. He asked in confusion. Mavis. I might have lied a little bit, Mavis admitted hesitantly. Ichibe, I mean no offense or anything, but... She paused for a moment, trying to find the words to answer with. I already know, Ichibe stated before she could find them. What you needed, at that moment in time, was our aid. Our aid to find the source of whatever has caused this catastrophe, so you and Ichigo will have as much time as possible to prevent it. What gave it away? A thought I had. Or rather a concern. I'm aware that Fairy Sphere is used as the means for traveling through time, a way of protecting the users from the deadly currents of time itself, and I figure a large surface area is going to cause your magical power to be worn down faster. I hadn't been sure initially whether that 7-day estimate had taken that into account, but after some consideration I figured it was the most likely option. I hope you are the only one who came to that conclusion. Ichigo couldn't help but agree with Mavis there. If Waiwak knew. Well, there was a reason he wasn't that keen on the plan in general. Traveling back in time didn't mean that their previous actions in the past stopped. It was what made this whole situation dangerous, despite its necessity. It would have been tricky alone with just him, but it would be far worse with 4 others. And of those 4, Waiwak was the one he wished to take back the least. Once they were back in time, Waiwak would not need them anymore so long as he had the knowledge of what he needed to do. It would be the perfect time for him to betray them, and a moment where he would return to his strongest with his sight returning. Was that all you had to ask, Ichibe, or was there something more than your suspicions? Ichigo asked cautiously. If we're careful we might be able to squeeze more people into a single small barrier, but dash. No, do not worry about me. He frowned at Ichibe's answer. You realize that means abandoning you in this era, right? I have already spoken about this with Hibarian and Aoesu. We are both prepared for this outcome. But, tell me, which is better? All of us going back in time, Waiwak included, or merely you and Mavis? He didn't answer. It didn't matter though. His silence told Ichibe enough. Now, what I needed to ask of you. First of all, you are both sure you can access Lumen Histoire's power freely? Not just magical power. He wasn't sure honestly, but saying that would be admitting that he wasn't even sure if their one hope would work. All he could count on was Mavis's word, since he couldn't confirm anything for himself. Not since his glimpses into the future had stopped the moment when magic had vanished. We should be able to, Mavis offered, slightly hesitant in her answer. I know perhaps this isn't what you want to hear. You want absolute confirmation. But I can't actually confirm everything entirely until we try. Why do you think it won't work? He asked Ichibe. Do you know something? Just theories and suspicions, Ichibe replied swiftly. Waiwaka's power lets him see the future, but now he can see nothing. And while you haven't said anything, I have noticed your own power in that area hasn't been acting up since that moment too. Both are forms of time magic, and yours is tied tightly to the magic of Lumen Histoire. Their sight isn't working because of how they work in the first place, Mavis stated before he could even offer any explanation. The ability to peer into the future can be compared to looking through an open doorway. That's all that happens. They glimpse through the vortex of time and see out the other side. But with magic gone, what kept that door open has shut. The connection of their magic to time has been disrupted. Does the same apply to you at all? Mavis scoffed. I'm the magic of time travel, not the magic of future sight. I don't have a door constantly open because I just open them myself, wherever and whenever I please. So long as time still exists, I can open the doorway to it. I see. That's good. So why are you unsure if your power will work? Mavis hesitated for a moment, muttered a few things quietly to herself before speaking her answer to Ichibe carefully. Opening a doorway is simple. It's easy. But right now I don't know what's on the other side. When magic was destroyed, a lot of things vanished. Magic is the building blocks of life in this world. But time is older. Much older. Before magic was here, after it's gone, time will always exist as a concept. And as long as it exists, I should be able to access it provided I can supply magic from my body to open a doorway. What I'm afraid about, however, she added, is the magical barrier particles. Because while time itself is not a result of magic, the manifestation of the realm that allows one to travel through it has no doubt taken on properties of magic over time, or at least properties similar enough. I'm afraid of the possibility that it could have been targeted in the same way magic was by the magical barrier particles. So if I open the doorway and find nothing there, it means there is no way back. Could there be any open passages to time that could have been exploited? Ichibe asked worriedly. The Eclipse Gate is known to be one. I don't know. The Eclipse Gate and any artifacts like it that join areas of space tend to be barely scratching the surface of time travel, so I doubt magical barrier particles could reach time itself through them. But there are old artifacts. Ancient ones, some yet to be discovered and yet to be made. If even a single one exists in the current era and was left open, well, most tend to slam shut when the magic gets cut off. But we won't know for certain until we eventually try and use my power to travel back. So we merely have to hope then. My second question then. If things go according to schedule, your attempt will be a day and a half from now at the latest. That will, after taking into account the magic you're losing currently, let you travel back in time to one day before all this happened, correct? That's right. Can you go back further? Weren't you listening? Mavis asked in annoyance. I told you dash. With the barrier you can. But could you go back further without it? Or with only part of it? Mavis paused for a moment before giving her answer, weighing up the possibility of what Ichibe was suggesting. I can, she admitted. And since my body is unaffected by the magic of time, I would be fine. But for anyone else, even for most immortals, it would be extremely dangerous. Contact with the raw flow of time, even for a moment, can age the user drastically. Ichigo experienced it once before when we had to make a jump back to avoid Wiwak without the full barrier, and it really weakened him before his regeneration allowed him to recover. And that was for a trip minutes into the past, not days. So the time present in there is the issue. Yes. Without the barrier, it'll be impossible to reach as far back as we want to go. However, that wasn't accounting for Ichigo's Bankai, was it? Ichibe pointed out. I won't pretend to understand the functionality of your magic, so I'll need you to correct any misunderstands I have on it. When you open a doorway and step into the flow of time, you make sure the barrier is up. You're right so far. And after that you let drift back, keeping an eye out for the right moment in time before dropping out of a new doorway to your destination. Also correct. Why drift? Ichigo asked before Ichibe could say anything else. A chuckle came from the monk at his words, as if the man had expected that to be asked. That's what you're wondering about, isn't it? Whether we can move faster so the magic being expended can take us back further. My magic opens up the doorway around Fairy Sphere, stated Mavis. We're already put on a set motion dash. But we weren't before. That was different, Mavis argued. We were being rushed and had to simply throw ourselves in with a weakened barrier dash. But it still worked. Didn't we have some momentum going into that? And it had some drastic consequences for you, Mavis argued back at him. You won't survive the journey without the barrier. And we can't build up enough speed with it. He couldn't deny she was right. He wasn't willing to test his luck the whole journey back when only a small amount of time in there had been dangerous once before. But if he could deal with just that much. Could you activate Fairy Sphere within the flow of time? He found himself asking hopefully. Or even just complete it within there. If we used my Bankai and built up enough speed on the outside, and then activated Lumen Histoire and had me slam into the barrier to force it forward dash. you'd end up shattering it like that. I won't be able to form it all quickly enough, Mavis stated, though not nearly as critically as before. But maybe there might be something we can do instead. I'm all ears. Fairy Sphere's purpose is to protect the user from the effects of time itself, but it also doubles as a physical barrier. When the barrier is complete and concentrated down like the one I always cast, it is unbreakable so long as the magic fueling it remains. The only chance one has is to act before it finishes. I know this. How does that help us now if you can't form it in time? Because I might be focusing too much on the need for it to be a physical barrier, Mavis admitted. Contrary to what many people might believe, I have not experienced time travel myself too many times. I must have taken something like 3 or 4 trips in my lifetime before I met you, and though my memory of those times isn't what it once was, I do remember the knowledge that my creator was apparently there. It's likely those trips were my lessons to understand and practice with my magic, despite my existing understanding of it. And one thing I remember from those times was why a barrier was so important. It was probably my second trip, Mavis said, thinking carefully on her memories. I took a liking to a bird, you see. Or maybe it was a dog. Or a cat. I suppose it doesn't really matter what kind of animal it was. I liked it, and back then I was really quite spoilt. So I took it, deciding I'd take it home and show my creator. I had, however, left home using Lumen Histoire, so naturally I made the return trip like normal. Mavis sighed sadly as she remembered what she had seen. The moment I returned I had dust slipping through my fingers. The animal I had taken a liking to was young, probably a child, and in the time it took to make that trip it had died, decayed, and slowly turned to dust as it felt the force of raw time attacking every inch of it. That was the day I was forced to remember that living things weren't like me who could survive the trip unscathed. So I worked to make a barrier, Mavis said after a moment of silence. I knew what needed to be kept out, so I did my best to ensure time couldn't penetrate the barrier. It was easy enough to understand and perform for me, but thinking back it might have been that loss that made me overlook things. So long as the magic holding back time is there, it really doesn't have to take a physical form. And if it doesn't have to take a physical form, it isn't bound by the same limitations that the world would have imposed on it. So you could avoid it from shattering if I moved at my top speed? He asked hopefully. That I won't just crash through it or leave it behind. The barrier in that form would be constantly focused on an area around myself. I can set the range, though naturally the larger the range the more magic I need to expend, but it would be constantly around us. The only danger is that you will be very dependent on making sure to not lose your grip on me. Time has its bumps and waves too, and if the barrier isn't physical, then if you get separated from me it'll all be over. That's a risk worth taking. Great to hear it, Ichibe said joyfully to them, reminding them of his presence that they had accidentally forgotten about. Tell me then, how far back do you think you could go with this method? It's hard to say, Mavis admittedly unsurely. This is unmarked territory for me. I know the barrier will work in theory, but I don't quite know how much magic that will be expended by it. It'll cost more since I won't be able to control the leakage, and since it'll be constantly moving to keep pace with us, so that would normally really reduce the time. But with the potential speed we can bring to our trip, I could maybe buy us another 2 days. So 3 days before we fought Baragan, Ichibe stated. Worst case, we would have set off already. Best case, you might be able to warn us about something before we go. However, I think it might be best to allow us to move as we were originally planning. Allow us to deal with Baragan while you focus on stopping whatever is happening in Fiori. Recruit Ziref and God Serena for that end if need be. Acknowledge will only keep them for so long. You really think he'll work with me? Who? Ziref. Who else? The man hates me. Hate is a strong word. Undoubtedly true, but it's fueled by an ugly jealous in my eyes. But regards of his feelings, Ziref would help you even if it was reluctantly. He'll try and backstab you afterwards, but only after the threat is gone and he is safe once more. God Serena meanwhile is a lot more willing to assist, so he should be able to watch your back for you if you are worried. Hopefully. Now the only matter is how to stop Wywak from trying to grab a ride back or to delay us from running. Leave that to Hiberion. He explained the plan you and Warod made with him. A clever one indeed, taking advantage of his current weakness, and if he proves to be able to overcome it, then Aoesu and I shall buy you the last few moments you need. Though part of me worries that it won't be Wiwak that will be the issue. You think Mimiheiji really has manifested? I don't know. I didn't feel anything that suggested as such, and I should have done if he had manifested. I would never forget his presence after fighting him so long ago. But even if he isn't here, something still unsettles me. Like there is something I have overlooked. Protector of the fairies. Ichigo, we need to keep moving. I know, he muttered, trying to do his best to keep up. It wasn't easy though. It had taken almost all their remaining time to reach this point, but they had finally reached what looked like the front lines of a massive battle. He didn't recognize the place. It wasn't where the front lines had been before. It was much further in than it should have been, and they had only had to follow the corpses to find where the battle had moved to. Only once they reached it, there was a sea of bodies in their path. Forces of Ishgar, forces of Alvarez, right now it hardly made a difference which was which. There were just so many dead that they all blended together. And yet even so he would find himself pausing scanning the faces he could see and dreading the moment where he would recognize one of them. I have to say though, Aoesu said as they continued to journey further through the lifeless battlefield, these pillars are disturbing. Anyone else getting a similar vibe from them? No, I sense it too, he admitted as he glanced up at one of the nearest pillars. Throughout Fiori, ever since they had landed on the sandy shores, they had been able to see these. Most they hadn't gone near enough to identify properly, but they had at least seen similar structures in the distance everywhere they looked. They weren't easy to miss. Towering above them all, with what looked like a face etched into the top, they created quite an ominous presence to be around. And that was without the large mass of magical barrier particles around each one. They looked old though. Judging by the ground, some of them must have erupted from the earth, but it begged the question on how long they had been there for. Centuries? He wanted to say longer. Work of this scale would have been a massive undertaking due to the sheer numbers of them, and there was no way they could have all been constructed in recent times and also kept hidden from any curious eyes. This was reflected in some of the pillars. Every once in a while they found one that still looked pristine, but when they saw the others they could only assume that it had simply been preserved better against the wear of time. Many of the others had cracks or chips, or in some severe cases even large chunks missing from them. When do you think these were made? He asked the blacksmith. Any rough estimates? Tough to say, Aoesu grumbled back, obviously not liking what he saw in the pillars going by the intense looks he kept shooting them. What do you think about these? Going by their uniformity, you would assume they were built by the same organization, right? That's what I'd assume. A group like the Nervits who built Nirvana, only a lot older. You see, that's what I thought as well, Aoesu stated in agreement. The size of these things, the design of the faces, the very material they are built out of, it's all the same. And when we consider the amount of them and how they have been scattered in all directions, you'd have to assume that whichever group built these either had territory spanning all of this land or simply had no resistance from any other groups. The latter could work if we're dealing with some old religion, if it was widespread and popular enough, and the detail in these is almost unnecessary. From a construction point of view, it's more work, extremely detailed work at that, which means there was some influence or reason to include it. So the face could represent some goddess perhaps. Or an interpretation of one. Aoesu gave a sharp nod. I'd say so. Though the detail on it. As a fellow craftsman, I can appreciate the effort one puts into their work. Whoever built that part put a lot of care into it. Which is what was bothering me for a bit. Ichigo frowned. How so? Not surprised you can't tell, Aoesu replied swiftly. No offense or anything, but you're a fighter first and foremost. The others likely haven't noticed either because they come from a variety of roles and positions. But me? I'm just a simple blacksmith who put his heart and soul into his craft, practicing and practicing until my hands bled and never stopping seeking perfection. I was made Nukin because my talent was useful, and afterwards I learned how to fight with it, but I'm more like a piece that was added to fulfill a role compared to the likes of others. But because of that I can see things none of you even bother notice, Aoesu added after a brief moment of staring at the face on the nearby pillar again. Stuff like the minute details none but one who has searched through their own work for the slightest flaw would see. Go to two different master swordsmiths and you won't be able to tell the difference between their works, I reckon. But they'd know. They'd never miss the slight imperfections. And that's what's bothering you? Is there something different in the designs? No, Aoesu stated seriously. That's what's bothering me. Every single one of these looks like the work of the same man or woman. Identical indents beneath the right eye, the slight difficult made in the attempt at etching hair into the stone in a wavy fashion, the care done to make the nose look slightly crooked, it all looks the same even to me. Even if the body of these pillars was mass-produced, the same cannot be said for the face on the top. For the work to be this identical, it could only have been done by the same person. Can't it still be possible? It might take them their lifetime but dash. I know, Aoesu muttered. It's still entirely possible. And if they had an extended life like us, they could have done it in all that extra time. Mavis, how many pillars would you say are in Fiori alone? Going by their positioning and distance apart from one another. Mavis paused briefly, glancing around a few times at the others as she calculated. Got to be a few hundred. And if they covered all of Ishgar? Thousands, Mavis answered immediately. Assuming of course that they are scattered at the same distance apart from another. For now then let's just concern ourselves with Fiori alone. We can assume the work done to hide them could have been done by others. The detail only hints at the same individual. Going by the number in Fiori, there is no doubt it would taken countless years to finish them all. So still doable. Does this matter though? Normally? No, Aoesu admitted. We hardly care about appreciating the work, nor do we even know from what era these came from or why no one has ever discovered any of them in the past few hundreds of years when peace has truly managed to settle in for longer-term periods. When I first saw some of them, I thought they must have been built potentially thousands of years ago. Only. Aoesu paused for a moment, glancing at the nearest pillar again before turning his attention to one slightly further away. There's oddities in them. How so? Some look old. Very old. Old enough that they have begun breaking down, time taking much from them. That would fit with them being ancient. Even the strongest of materials cannot endure forever. But then I see one that looks pristine. One that lacks any erosion on its body or has taken damage over those long years. And for some to be in such bad states but for others to be like this. It caught my attention too much. Honestly speaking, some of them look like they could have been built hundreds of years ago in comparison to thousands. And some? Decades ago. Ichigo froze, taking another look at the pillars with great suspicion now. But you said the same person designed these. Which is why I haven't ruled out the possibility that they are immortal to some degree like us. Question is why he or she kept making them for so long. What's the point? What do they represent? And if they could build any in the last century, how have we never seen any sign of this? Could it have been Avatar? The magical barrier particles, right? Ichigo nodded. Yeah. I mean they're still lingering around these pillars. That looks awfully suspicious in my books. I'd agree, but as for Avatar being involved. Aoesu let out a sigh. Someone I doubt it. This is large-scale work, and Avatar? They stuck to the shadows until recently. They'd never be able to build, transport and hide so many of these. One or two maybe, but they simply lack the ability if they also wish to remain unnoticed by the world. Then who? Is there even an organization that existed for long enough to continue this? I don't know. But if one was willing to make deals, there are many ways to force something to stay hidden. And the construction of some of these in the last few decades could very well be part of that. Protector of the fairies. It finally happened. He knew it was coming. Had known for a while now. No one had been alive yet. The further they got, the less injured the bodies were until eventually most of them looked like they had just collapsed, no signs of injuries or wounds visible to them. After seeing body after body like this, he had known what to expect. Eventually they had moved past the majority of Alvarez's bodies and had encountered an overwhelming majority of their own. And at that moment he had begun to brace himself for what was coming. After trudging through the field of corpses for so long, and running low on energy from having to sacrifice sleep one too many times over the past few days, he eventually stumbled as it caught up to him, falling as he tried to catch himself while supporting Mavis on his back. He couldn't manage both and so prioritized the latter, falling face first into the ground and groaning from the impact. "Sorry, I didn't realize you were tired," Mavis uttered. "I can walk if you dash." "Conserve your energy," he said as he cut her off. "I can keep going for longer." He really was tired, but he could bear with it for a bit longer. He simply didn't have the magic to waste on his regeneration right now. Pressing one hand against the ground, he began to push himself back up, moving his head off the ground and looking straight ahead. And then he froze. He'd known he was eventually going to see this. But he still hadn't been ready for it. Lying there peacefully was Nozomi, her head resting against the ground with her hair falling to one side. Her eyes were closed, almost as if she was sleeping, and he wanted to believe she was more than anything. He could hear Mavis saying something to him. Something reassuring probably. But he couldn't hear it. It felt like his ears were stuffed with cotton right now, and he could focus on was the woman in front of him. Hesitantly a hand reached out for her, being pressed against her cheek and feeling the coldness of her skin. His hand moved to her neck. No pulse. Dead, and had been for a while now. Just like all the rest. "Ichigo," Mavis said to him, her words finally becoming clearer. "Are you all right?" He didn't answer that, instead choosing to stand as he slowly began to look around at the other bodies nearby. He recognized them. He recognized far too many of them. Not too far away he saw a familiar head of blue hair, collapsed in a heap with a one hand still outstretched. It looked like she had even tried to write something into the dirt but had died too quickly. Elsewhere he saw a white-scaled scarf, its owner not far away from it. Elsewhere he saw something more dragon than human, but behind it was even more bodies he recognized. It looked like whoever that was had protected the others, and immediately he could recognize him even if the form was different now. So many bodies. So many faces. Not just Fairy Tail but others from guilds he knew. How had he missed all of them? How had he not noticed any of them? Oh. Wasn't it because he hadn't been looking? He hadn't. Not really. He had scanned the bodies as he had walked, but he hadn't wanted to see this. So he had ignored it. Ignored the reality before him because it was easier to hope that they were alive, even for a bit longer, than to admit to what he was seeing. All of them were dead. Every single one of them. And he hadn't been able to do a single thing to stop it from happening. "Ichigo. It'll be okay," Mavis whispered to him softly. When we go back, things will be different. They'll still be alive. You'll be able to see them again." "I know that," he muttered. "I know I will. When we go back, everything will be as it was before. They'll still be laughing. Crying. Fighting. Maybe even smiling. But these versions of them won't be. I'm sorry. It's not your fault," he reassured her. She already knew the same pain in the first place. She had said as much to Warod, and that had been hard enough when he was alive. But she also knew that saying goodbye to someone and knowing they would die afterwards was easier to handle than to see the reality before one's eyes. Why did they all have to die? And why did they have to all die like this? It looked like they never even got a chance to defend themselves. Perhaps it was simply the sheer amount of magical barrier particles ripping their magic from them and leaving them as lifeless husks. But if that was the case, what was Laxus protecting the others from? He asked himself, walking over towards some of the others. The people behind Laxus looked like they had fallen in a similar way to most of the people here, but there were anomalies all around him if he looked closely. Why had Levi tried to write something? What was she trying to write? Crouching down as he reached her, he did his best to try and read it. There was no longer any wind to have distorted the words she had tried to write in the dirt, but her work had been left unfinished, an outstretched finger lying across the third letter she had tried to write. The rest of the word could have been anything with only 2 characters to go off. Moving to another body, he looked at Natsu this time. Why was he separated from his scarf? Natsu never took it off. Never. No matter what was happening, No matter how bad the situation, that scarf was always wrapped around Natsu's neck. And that same item he cherished so much was lying far away from him. Finally he moved over to Laxus himself. He wasn't quite sure what to make of his friend's new body. The arms and legs weren't even connected to his body, but if they were anything like what he had seen of Laxus's right arm, then it meant that they had been connected by the man's magic. And without it, they would naturally lose that connection. If that had been all, he could have ignored it all. He could have moved on and looked for something else. But the ground Laxus was lying in was covered in dried blood. Turning his friend's body over, he quickly found the source, a large wound through his chest where he figured Laxus's heart would be if his physiology was still the same. No one else around here was wounded. Scratched and cuts maybe, but Laxus looked out of place with his injury. Who had he fought here that no one else had? And who had he been protecting the others from? Had they been still conscious? Or had he been protecting their bodies hoping they were still alive? Odd, isn't it? He heard Waiwak suddenly say to him. He resisted the urge to leap away in shock, unsure of when the man had even managed to sneak up on him. Most of the people here fell. But it also looks like a battle could have taken place here too. No, battle isn't quite the word I'm looking for. Actual. This is more like a slaughter. Who? Who do you think did this? To damage your friend so severely, I'd say someone capable of overcoming his resistance to magic. And the easiest way to do that is with either Dragon Slayer magic or with the energy around us. Right now I'd say it was the latter. More hidden cards of Avatar? No, if it was, then where is Pernida? Pernida's your weapon against this energy, right? Indeed. Not one I designed, but one I found. For magical particle battles to win so easily against equal amounts of magic means they aren't opposites targeting one another's weakness, but rather that magical barrier particles are a distortion that is made to target magic. Pernida is magic's response to that. A being who is made to target magical barrier particles in the same way. And for that reason he is a unique being, incompatible with almost all magic. Would he lose to numbers? Avatar would have to have a lot of numbers. But I feel like most of them, if not all of them, were spent on their attempt with Baragan. Even if they had cards left to play, they shouldn't be able to beat Pernida. That I am confident on. Then what would be enough to make Pernida lose? Mimi Heiji, Waiwak spoke without hesitation. Pernida was designed to fight Mimi Heiji, should he ever appear. For that aim, Pernida has been reborn again and again over thousands of years. Right now Pernida should be near the peak of his power thanks to my influence, and for him not to be here suggests he was killed. Which would suggest Mimi Hagi's involvement, Ichigo concluded. But we haven't sensed anything about him appearing according to Ichibe. I know. To make matters worse, we haven't found Ziraf yet either. Nor his follower. There were 2 Ukin left on this continent, and yet we haven't seen hide nor hair of them. You might want to see this, guys, called out Hibarian. The 2 glanced over at the fellow Ukin and following the direction he was gesturing towards. I think we found someone still alive. Protector of the fairies. This was wrong. This was terribly wrong. The closer Ichigo got to the man, the more he felt that way. Like there was something innately wrong about this person on a fundamental level. And every cell in his body was telling him to flee now before it was too late. They all sensed it. But not one of them wanted to dare utter their fears. It was as if uttering them, speaking those words, would make them a reality and force them to abandon what little hope they had of being wrong. Sneaking a glance at Ichibe hadn't helped him one bit either. The man's face was as blank as could be, giving nothing away. But that only served to tell him more than it hid. Each of them wasn't hesitating to be prepared for anything either. Ichibe had his Zanpakuto already released, ink splattering across the ground as he walked. Aoesu was progressing forward slowly, constantly ready to strike at any moment with his blade. Waiwak had a sword of his own ready, positioned in such a way that it could be brought up and sacrificed at a moment's notice if danger stuck. Hibarian had already cut into his body and was letting blood flow freely now, arming himself with as much of the liquid as possible. As for himself, he had the larger of his 2 Zanpakuto blades drawn and was gripping onto Mavis tightly. She meanwhile had his other blade, the Zanpakuto, held tightly in one hand, and was ready to go for their eyes at a moment's notice if need be in order to draw out their shared blade. With each step they took, he felt his heart beating faster and faster, each step sounding like it was echoing loudly around them and would alert the man to their presence. Only when they were close enough to see him properly, standing close enough to speak, did he appear to make any sort of movement in response to them. They were all immediately on edge as the man began to turn, the time it took being agonizingly slow at the pace the man was going at. It was lazy, not one of someone who was alert but of someone who was wondering what had caught his attention. And as the man turned, he got his first real look at him. At first glance, the man could have passed for normal. Long black hair, far longer than he had seen on most guys, trailed down the man's back, and a curious expression seemed to be filling the man's eyes. That was where the familiar human traits began to distort. The center of his eyes was pure darkness, lacking any visible pupil at all, and across the visible skin dark markings stretched across all areas, sometimes appearing like tattoos and other times dark veins, pulsing with life. But what truly bothered him about this man's appearance was how familiar it looked to him. Before he could think any more on why that was, he noticed something far more pressing. In one hand the man was scratching his cheek, looking at them in confusion, while in the other he held a man by the neck, dragging him across the ground. "That's Zeref," he heard Mavis whisper in shock, seeing the lifeless corpse of the dark mage held like a doll by the man in front of them. "That man. Get away. Get away now." How odd. The man's voice sounded rough when he spoke, as if he was finding it difficult to speak. "I wasn't expecting any of you. Did the commie cake miss you? Or is this simply too far afterwards to have been picked up by it?" "Mimi Heiji," Ichibe muttered, confirming to them all what they had feared. "So it really is you. Do I?" "Oh, I remember you," Mimi Heiji muttered, directing his gaze over at the monk as he began to smile in amusement. "You look so different that I almost didn't recognize you. Who would have thought that the peace-loving man of back then would come to find such joy in taking life? How the years change us all. What have you done?" "But this is a surprising little gathering," Mimi Heiji said, ignoring Ichibe in favor of the others. "Let me see here." The undead bloodsucker, separated from his dearly beloved. The uncaring blacksmith, away from his forge for what must be the longest time in decades. The Quincy king, devoid of his legacy and dreams due to the acts of jealous hearts. "And then there's you," Mimi Heiji said as he turned towards Ichigo himself. "The self-proclaimed protector, whose idea of saving involves self-sacrifice. The man who would throw his childhood away for the sake of those unable to comprehend the destruction their actions bring." Mimi Heiji paused briefly, his smile wavering slightly as he glanced at Mavis. "Going by your presence, I doubt I'm mistaken on who you are." Mavis Vermilion, the living consciousness of Lumen Histoire itself. And in a physical body nonetheless. "It was hard to get a glimpse of you before, so please excuse me if I seem unfamiliar." "You seem to know us pretty well," Waiwak stated, taking a few steps forward and allowing his sword to lower so that it was hanging by his side. "And we have heard a lot about you. Are you the reason Pernida isn't here?" "I did wonder who found him this time," Mimi Heiji said, a slight tint of anger entering his voice. "It normally never matters who does. But the cruelty he has been placed under, the curse he was afflicted with. And to be placed under a man like you? I see now why magic allowed you to be the one that found him. He actual was difficult to fight. For a few minutes at least." "So he is dead then," Waiwak said, stopping right in front of Mimi Heiji and throwing an arrogant look down upon him. "A pity. I had expected more from your older brother. But I guess he died a worthless death once again." "Yes. It is such a pity." Without any warning Mimi Heiji struck out, swinging Zeref's body up at the Quincy as if it was a blade. The body alone wouldn't have done much, but the speed it was going at and the magical barrier particles that spread across every surface more than made up for its lack of strength. Waiwak had been expecting the attack from the very beginning, however. As the body swung, his sword came up in defense as he pushed off the ground and retreated back, the blade shattering upon contact but allowing him another time to move out of the way. Right as he leaned to one side, Ichibe showed himself, having closed the distance when Waiwaka's body had blocked Mimihagi's sight, and swung his Zanpakuto, ink splattering all across Mimihagi's body from head to toe. Taking the chance as Mimi-Heiji suddenly stopped moving, Ichibei spun his Zanpakuto around as its form began to change, the blade of the brush turning pure white while a long thread extended off from the end back around him. Shinuke, Shirafudekimanji. With great speed the Zanpakuto was stabbed forward and swiped with characters being written at an alarming speed over Mimi-Hagi's body before the word ant was easily visible to all of them. Strike now. He's nothing but an ant. That's what I figured. Called out Aoesu, charging from one side while Hibarian lunged in from the other. Blood was swung in a wide arc while a blade came down from the other side. And in response to all of that, Mimi-Heiji simply vanished. For a moment Ichigo was sworn he had seen it wrong. That his eyes had been playing tricks on him. Then he even considered possible teleportation. But it wasn't any of that. Without him even realizing or able to properly keep track of Mimi-Heiji, the man had crossed the distance over to Ichibei and had swung out with his hand, magical barrier particles breaking through the ink that covered his right arm and slicing straight through Ichibei's neck. Reaching out as Ichibei's head began to fall, Mimi-Heiji caught it with ease before bringing it up to his own. With every move he made, the ink that clung to his body was washed away, magical barrier particles tearing about the attempt Ichibei had made to restrain him with laughable ease. All these years and it seems you didn't learn from back then. How many of you all died last time you tried to stop me? You've wasted your efforts, boy. Ichibei. Aoesu lunged at Mimi-Heiji once more, his sword swinging down and cutting through the magical barrier particles rising to meet him. The place was mere moments away from reaching Mimi-Hagi's neck when it happened again, Mimi-Heiji merely glancing back before avoiding the attack with almost lazy ease. You're being annoying now. Leave. One moment the air was filled with magical barrier particles, the next every single one of them in the nearby vicinity was resting in the palm of Mimi-Hagi's hand, compressed down to the extreme. Aoesu only had the time to blink before that orb was thrust into his chest and exploded through him, leaving nothing but a mess of blood when it was done. Well, who wants to try their luck next? How about? Mimi-Hagi's gaze landed on Ichigo briefly, a small frown crossing his head for a moment. You. He took a step forward before Wiwak appeared in his line of sight, a massive arrow of energy grasped held in the air behind him. Go now. We'll hold him here. Wiwak roared, snapping Ichigo out his trance. Wiwak knew, didn't he? That he would have never taken the Quincy King back. And now he was telling him to go anyway. It spoke of how dangerous this enemy was when Wiwak could only claim to hold him there. So without any more hesitation he turned the other way and began to run, his Bankai forming as Mavis lowered the smaller of his Zanpakuto into the first. She quickly reached for her eye before doing the same for him, the two pieces forming the usual dagger while he spared a quick glance behind. The air was filled with artificial light, thousands of arrows falling like a downpour of rain. But against Mimi-Heiji it was like the man was holding up an umbrella, a shield of magical barrier particles held up with one hand as he deflected Hibarian's close-range strikes one after the other. Letting out what sounded like a bloodthirsty roar, Hibarian lunged for Mimi-Hagi's throat before a hand grabbed him by the face and squeezed, crushing the man's skull before discarding him to one side to focus on Wiwak alone. The moment Mavis slotted their shared blade into place, however, he couldn't stay and see anymore. With the blade out, their connection was stronger than ever, giving them the best chance of survival within the flow of time, and with a single kick off the ground he was away from the battlefield and zooming towards the horizon. With each kick he was picking up speed, pushing himself to his maximum limit possible as Mavis prepared to open a path for them to charge straight into. And right as she was about to open a doorway, he heard a voice speak beside his ear. Are you going somewhere? His head snapped to the side, the face of Mimi-Heiji mere inches away and staring at him in annoyance. His words were cut off when a fist slammed straight into his chest, magical barrier particles tearing straight through and causing him to go crashing down uncontrollably towards the ground. It took everything he had to keep his grip on Mavis, turning his body so that she was shielded from the fall. Hitting the ground didn't hurt much. The physical enhancements granted by his Bankai prevented all but the strongest blows from being felt. But the hole through his gut was another matter, the magical barrier particles clinging to it eating away at him from the inside and batting away any attempts he made to try and regenerate the damaged tissue. It was bad enough that what little magic he could spare normally was being eaten away at just to repair his body with his regeneration. At this rate he doubted he could maintain this for another minute at the rate his magic was being exhausted at. "Mavis, don't bother about waiting until I reach my max speed next time," he muttered to her quietly. "We won't have time. The moment we're clear, get ready. An extra few hours won't mean anything if we don't escape." Keeping his focus carefully on Mimi Heiji as the man landed on the ground, he did his best to ignore the pain as he kept his body as still as possible, trying to conserve as much energy as possible. For Mimi Heiji to have caught up meant he had either broken free of Waiwak or had killed him. Considering the ease he killed the others, he supposed it was the latter. "Ichigo." He frowned slightly, hearing a faint voice calling out to him from within his mind. Was that Ichibe? "Why don't we sit down for a bit, Ichigo?" Mimi Heiji said as he closed the gap between them suddenly, poking a finger against the wound he had caused and causing Ichigo to let out a brief cry of pain. "That really looks like it hurts." He hardly had time to think with the pain, swinging his sword with all his strength. He felt his arm shatter and his swing go further than he wanted, his regeneration immediately trying to patch the arm back together, but he had a greater worry at that moment. His sword was missing half its length. As for the rest, it had all been consumed by the mass of magical barrier particles that had gathered against Mimihagi's side, having burst out from his skin like a spray of blood. "Say my name. Hurry." "That wasn't nice," Mimi Heiji muttered, glancing briefly at the mass of magical barrier at his side before sighing and nodding his head slightly. That same mass immediately changed shape, forming a large spike that suddenly shot forward and slammed straight through his leg. He couldn't help but roar out in pain, gripping onto Mavis tightly as he tried not to fall. If he fell it'd be all over. "Come now, just go down. If I wanted to kill you, you'd be dead already, you know. And really, I don't like the idea of doing that to you of all people." He could feel his body straining as his magic started to hit its limits. He had to run. To get away now. But with how fast Mimi Heiji had caught up to him last time, he'd never be able to make a move without him stopping him first. He needed a moment. Just one moment. "Hurry. Call my name. Ichibe Hyosub." He wasn't sure why he had ended up trusting so blindly in those words. Maybe it was because he had nothing else left to try. It didn't matter. What did was that the moment those words were uttered, Ichibe was standing in between him and Mimi Heiji, a sinister smirk on his face as he grabbed the man before him and pulled him against his chest, locking him in place. "Go. Now." He didn't have to hear that twice. However Ichibe had survived, he didn't have time to question it. What he did know was that his magical power had suddenly dropped tremendously and he would only have a few seconds at most. With all the force he could muster he kicked off the ground with his good leg as hard as he could, doing his best to ignore the pain as it shattered and began to heal far slower than usual. This time Mavis didn't wait for them to go any faster, golden light forming like dust around them, keeping pace with their movement. Lumen Histo Ire. Space twisted all around them, the scene he had only witnessed once before when escaping from Waiwak. The surroundings of the future almost became completely distorted when a hand grasped onto his wounded leg, and then all three of them were flung into the flow of time at blinding speeds. Ichigo already knew who had grabbed onto him before he even saw him, Mimi Heiji gripping onto his leg with an iron grip. It was the only part of him inside the barrier with them however, which meant it was the only thing not rapidly aging. With every moment that they were flung backwards through time, Mimi Hagi's body aged until the body gave up entirely and decayed away. And yet still an iron grasp remained, the physical traits gone but the mass of magical barrier particles of Mimi Hagi's own spirit refusing to let go. "You won't stop me?" The disembodied voice roared, beginning to pull himself forward. Despite the danger to himself though, Ichigo was far more worried about the destruction being pulled back with them, time itself appearing to shatter as magical barrier particles ripped their way across every surface. "We need to pull him out with us," he hurried to tell Mavis. "How much further?" "I'm almost out of magic so this will have to do. I'll use what little I have left to drag him out." Space distorted around them once more and the golden mist-like barrier around them began to fade, earlier than it should have. He could feel his body beginning to age but he didn't dare tell Mavis while she was focusing. He only had to endure it for a moment longer, and with that moment passing he immediately found himself being flung through the air and looking up at a familiar sky. Before he had time to take it in, he was being slammed down against the ground. His Bankai wasn't even active anymore, his swords scattering around him with Mavis being flung to one side and hitting a tree. Meanwhile the spirit above him, looking far more like a mass of magical barrier particles than anything else, pinned him down there with a large right hand of the densest of that energy. "You won't stop me?" Mimi Heiji roared into his ears, even as before his very eyes he saw the large mass of magical barrier particles being broken apart, the familiar weight of magic being felt all around him as it exerted its full will on what it saw as an aberration. "Let it be known, now and forever, that I win. I will always win." And then the thing that had been Mimi Heiji was gone, and all that was left was a silence in the forest they had appeared in. Protector of the fairies. The clues of the past. Without realizing it, day had turned to night in the blink of an eye. Ichigo could only help but stare at it in confusion, his mind trying to piece it all together before he tried to shot up from the ground. Ow ow ow. He clutched his stomach in pain as he tried to sit up, noticing the sensation of cloth beneath his fingers, wrapped tightly around his chest. A makeshift bandage of some kind? That was new. He hadn't needed to wrap his wounds in a long time now. His regeneration rendered them useless. Further down he noticed a similar black bandage of cloth wrapped around his left leg, covering the hole that Mimi Heiji had made previously. "Your top's behind you if you want it." "Not much left of it though." He nodded in acknowledgement, glancing back and finding what remained of his usual shiakusho. The sleeves had been torn away entirely and the large stripes were missing here and there from what more material had obviously been needed. It looked like a mess, but it was better than nothing. Pulling it on, he glanced around briefly for the pieces of armor that helped carry his Zanpakuto before noticing them placed near the blades themselves, all the items resting near a fire. All but the dagger at least, but a quick check confirmed it had been returned to its sealed state in his and Mavis's eyes. His eyes quickly sought her out, panic briefly filling him and making him wonder what had happened. At some point it was obvious he had fallen unconscious, but how long had passed since then and how much had changed? Was she even safe? He was glad to find his fears weren't needed when he saw her huddled by the fire, the cloak he normally wore pulled tightly around her with the hood pulled up. It could barely suppress her magical power, and he was sure once she recovered the rest of it that it would be useless, but currently it appeared to be masking her presence. That was one thing to be thankful for at least, and he could only hope that would last. He didn't miss the other person sitting by the fire either. He'd already heard him earlier and he hadn't felt any need to be worried at that voice. His Edela's self wasn't someone he had to be wary of after all. "You've been practicing without telling me," he stated, carefully getting up to get closer to the fire. Upon taking one step though he found himself stumbling, his Edela's self leaping forward and grabbing him to keep him up straight before he could fall. "Watch it. You're more injured than you're used to." "I'll say," he muttered, letting himself be helped over to the fire and taking a seat on the ground beside his doppelganger. "My regeneration isn't working properly, is it?" "It is, and it isn't," his Edela's self replied calmly. "On the surface everything is fine. Being back in a magic-rich environment has allowed it to function at full capacity once again. The wounds your Bankai inflicted on you were healed within minutes of arriving back in this time, and it only took that long because your magical power was so low that it was struggling to recover while also dealing with a more pressing injury." "My gut." His Edela's self nodded. Mavis was panicking like crazy and she wasn't going to be able to think clearly in that state. "So I manifested and got to work. I figured if I could at least stem some of the blooding and cover the wound it might help even a tiny bit. So long as it reduced the strain of your regeneration, it would be worth it. And once Mavis began recovering magical power she immediately funneled it to you as best as she could so your regeneration wouldn't keep draining you of all your strength. So you manifested without requiring any assistance. You have been practicing." His Edela's self gave him an awkward shrug. "Not so much really. From the beginning I've always been able to act independently. It's why we could even pull off that double act at the Grand Magic Games. I normally do need you to make the body, but I've picked up enough to know how to manipulate my form enough to give it a physical quality. But for manifesting in the first place." Raising his hand, His Edala's self made a show of gathering energy before it formed into an exact copy of the smaller of his two Zanpakutu. I'll admit it's not perfect, his Edala's self explained. But with the old man gone, it was up to me to keep your Quincy abilities in check. I was already familiar with such abilities, even if I never possessed them myself and had to rely on replication, and after Zanjitsu himself I was the closest thing to you on a spiritual level. That was enough for me to take the old man's role entirely. It took some getting used to, but if the old man could do something, I can probably do the same now too. That includes physically manifesting in the world under borrowed power. Is that so? It was good in a way, but hearing about the old man never made his loss any easier. And knowing that the old man had been replaced was much easier than hearing it entirely. You're sure you have a full handle on it? Yeah. Think I even might have realized what your underlying script was underneath Waiwaka's power. The old man never mentioned anything, but my guess is that he was carefully nurturing it over the years even as the absorb grew stronger, as if to prepare for the day he might not be there anymore to keep you safe. That sounds like something he'd do. What is it? Going by my working theory, I'd call it the soul. You suspected right a while back that it lacked any offensive feels to it, instead making the other parts stronger. From what I can gather, it's an ability to pull things in and out and to delve into the very essence of what lies within. Sounds like the same as always, minus the ability to do that with attacks. Unless that still works. I wouldn't recommend it. The damage would probably do more harm than good. Storing raw magic in your own soul. Well, it would be a good way to tear it in half, I'd say. But it might at least mean we can still lock away Waiwaka's power, even if it means locking it within your soul. Without the Hujiaku in there anymore, and with the old man and the power of the absorb gone, and even with Mavis not needing to piggyback on your soul to get a decent supply of magic to use now that she has her own body to ground her, I'm sure you could hide or seal something large in there. Ichigo frowned briefly, a thought crossing his mind. What about a person? That might be difficult. It worked with you. Yeah, but I'm easy in comparison, his Edala's self muttered. Differences here and there, but our souls are still fairly similar that it knows how to handle me. But another person's soul would be tough. And Mimihagi's. So you knew. Of course I did, his Edala's self growled out. It's the kind of thing I'd do too, annoying another. If it was anyone else, maybe it would work. But Mimihagi's power would tear you to pieces in the process, and what's left would either be dead or would be dead a few moments later when he breaks free with his magical barrier particles. Ichigo nodded. Guess that's one plan out. Though on that note, my wounds. Yeah. I figure so too. I was saying before how your regeneration was working normally. But in the areas Mimihagi wounded you in. Your regeneration is doing its best, but Mimihagi's magical barrier particles are on a whole other level to any we have ever encountered before. Maybe it's because they came into contact with their source, but their strength and viciousness is so much greater than what we are familiar with. Bit by bit they are being eroded away, but it is slow going. They aren't staying quiet either, Mavis said as she spoke up, her eyes catching his as she looked at him worriedly. Her eyes looked red, and he doubted she had rested much if she had been supplying him with energy all this time to help out. The energy is tearing away at your insides. Your regeneration has enough of a handle on it now that it is beating the energy back and allowing new flesh to grow, but it's still so slow. Your leg will take at least 2 more days to fully heal. Your gut. Probably a month going by the current rate. If the energy doesn't degrade at the rate I'm assuming it will, it might even take longer. I can deal with it, he muttered. He wasn't used to long-standing pain, but he was sure he could put it to the back of his mind. However bad it was, it still had to be easier to endure than the sensation from his bankai of bones being shattered and repaired each time he moved and used too much force. How about you? I'm fine, Mavis replied quietly. He never touched me thanks to you. He was too focused to care that you had thrown me to one side. He was too busy trying to strangle you before he perished. I saw that myself, said his Edala's self, glancing at him in worry before pointing at his neck. Noticing the action, Ichigo glanced down at his neck carefully and managed to make out the edges of a bruise stretching up. At the end his grip was entirely made up of magical barrier particles, as was his body. I doubt the pain lingers anymore there, but the mark it left is still taking a while to clear up. He really wanted to kill you at that moment. Of course he did, Ichigo replied. The reason was obvious after all. It was the same reason why the others had all perished. I'm a Nukin, one of Magic's servants. He wanted me dead. I agreed. But at the same time. His Daedalus self paused, scratching his head in thought. Didn't it strike you as odd? That he was trying to kill me? Not much. I found it odd that he was, his Daedalus self stated. He didn't appear to want to before we traveled back in time. That's... He paused, realizing there was some truth in his doppelganger's words. Ichibe had fallen twice to Mimi Heiji in no time at all. Hibarian and Aoyasu had done their best but all fallen and died swiftly after. And Waiwak had managed to stall Mimi Heiji long enough to delay his own fate a few moments longer. All of those deaths had been swift. But with Mimi Heiji had gone after him. Come now, came the voice in the memory as the face of Mimi Heiji appeared in his mind. Just go down. If I wanted to kill you, you'd be dead already, you know. And really, I don't like the idea of doing that to you of all people. He didn't want to kill me. I noticed that too. Until we traveled back in time, he was reluctant. Very reluctant in fact, considering the wounds he gave you. The gut wound would kill a normal person, but if treated quickly enough and one had a way to recover. All he'd need to do would be to withdraw his energy and you'd be healed up in no time. If he wanted you dead, there were plenty of ways to have gone about it instead, but he was more interested in pacifying you. At least until we got here. After that he truly seemed to want to kill you, Mavis pointed out. He would have to, if not for his body breaking up faster than he could finish the job. Being exposed to the raw energy of time robbed him of his physical body, and it seems his essence cannot linger in this world properly when it's so full of magic without an anchor to bind itself to. He's quite like Zera, Nabera, and I in that sense. Which would match with why he needs a host to manifest in, Ichigo muttered before a horrible thought crossed his mind. Wait, what happened with time? His energy was leaking out as we were traveling back. How much damage did that do? The look Mavis had was immediately enough to alert him to the fact that something was wrong. She hesitated for a moment, uncertainty written clearly across her face, before finally she seemed to swallow her nerves to say what she needed to. As of the current moment, there is a point in time that is too dangerous to travel through. Isn't all of time generally dangerous to travel through? Isn't that the point of Fairies' sphere? Yes, but even that won't be enough for this brief period. Thanks to Mimihagi's energy lingering in the realm of time, any attempts to move through it with Fairy Sphere would have the barrier ripped to shreds. With a decent amount of magical power I'm sure I could make it, though it would be risky and I'd really need to rely on a physical barrier to help maintain my full focus, but for anything less than that, I don't think we would make it. So those few days are inaccessible to us? That's not really much of a problem since we don't plan to jump back again, though it does mean we can't afford to waste much time. How much dash? No, you don't understand Ichigo, Mavis stated urgently. I don't think we would make it. Our current selves did, but as a result we made this mess. If our past selves tried to do that same thing now, they would never reach the point we did. Well, I might still but not without taking some damage from the magical barrier particles themselves. But you. Gears clicked into place in Ichigo's mind as he realized just what had her so worried. We can't make a closed loop. I doubt we ever could, Mavis admitted. If we stop Mimi Heiji, it means stopping the reason we came back in time in the first place. It would cause a paradox, but on what scale I can't even begin to imagine. What's worse is that we truly can only rely on this one chance. We can't try and find as much as possible and leave it for our past selves to carry forward until one version of us finally finds the answer. We only have this single moment, and a mere 2 days left to do it. Damn, he muttered, running a hand through his hair in frustration. 1 day lost already due to my injuries. We need to cover as much ground as possible. Do we know when Zeref fought Aknologia? Unsure, but as of this current moment I do believe the dragon is alive, stated his Daedalus self, one hand held up and lightly tugging on a thread of magic as it flowed around his fingers. I can just about pick up his magical power here. Considering we saw no sign of the beast in the future and that Ziref had left to go elsewhere, it is safe to assume things went well. And we know a battle took place between the armies that continued right until Mimi Heiji must have showed up with the loss of the world's magic. So at some point in these 2 days, the battle with Aknologia ended. With how far his forces made it past the barrier's original lines, he must have been pushing even before the battle ended. Let's go under the assumption that the battle begins tomorrow at some point. Until that happens, things should still be calm, so we should try and take advantage of this to find out as much as possible. Once it begins, the chaos might make it harder to move undetected if we want to explore the areas where Mimi Heiji surfaced. Honestly, where we found him might be the best place to check first. Unless we have any other leads. None here. If that's all we've got, let's follow it. Hopefully it'll lead to something. I'll leave it up to you then unless I think of anything. Maintaining this form is tiring and even I need to rest too. Though I should ask you what you plan to do about transport. We can just... He paused, glancing at his leg in realization. He could certainly struggle through the pain, but it was undoubtedly going to interfere when he tried to cross large distances. And if he needed to fight at all, straining it too much was the worst thing he could do now. If he chopped off the leg entirely, though, he could regrow it, but using anything more than Shunpo to get around would be easy for him to be sensed. Mavis wasn't much of an option either. If anyone caught a whiff of her magical power, then they were sure to realize what they had done. If they didn't know the whole story, they were sure to overreact. God knows how Ziref would act in such a situation. If that man interpreted his actions as his willingness to now utilize time travel, he'd throw everything at him and his friends and forsake the consequences. There was one more reliable path open to them though. And it would at least help clear the image of her lifeless body from his mind if he could see her again. I should be able to make it over to the main camp. Let's go see if we find Nozomi. Protector of the Fairies. Is that you, Ichigo? Ichigo had to resist the urge to freeze in place, hobbling forward as if he had heard nothing. Beside him, Mavis did her best to remain hidden, an illusion cast over them both to distort their usual appearances. The moment they had arrived at camp, he'd realized they would have a problem getting in undetected. Considering all of the times where he had been simply able to stroll in, or in some cases teleport right to where he needed to go thanks to Nozomi or Mest, he hadn't ever noticed how heavily watched the camp was. Patrols he had never needed to notice constantly rotated in and out as time passed, the men and women taking their chance to rest before ending up on alert once again or sent to the front lines instead. Most were rune knights. The mages tended to be dedicated to the battlefields when they were fighting and were allowed much more time to rest due to their importance, so those he had to get past weren't the kind he would struggle to fight. But since he didn't want to fight or draw attention to himself, they had proved a real annoyance to deal with. In the end, the easier option available to them had been for him to pretend to be injured. They would have recognized him immediately, so Mavis had done her best to place an illusion over the two of them, though even he could tell it wasn't the best. Her skill was in real illusions, ones meant to be interacted with, and her solution had been to have them wear a second skin of sorts in the form of her power. To really sell the image, she had even made him a set of crutches for him to use to walk with, and it probably helped that he had cut off his leg to make it look like he truly needed them. The only difficult part was holding back his regeneration, and if he slipped up and lost focus, he was sure that lost limb would be replaced in seconds. In the end, the guards had let him through pretty easily, buying the excuse Mavis had given that she'd found him wandering about. She had mentioned something about the illusion around him making him look quite old, so they probably thought age was getting to him and that Mavis was one of the younger medics trying to look after him. Once inside the camp, they had barely been looked at twice. Sights like him weren't exactly uncommon. He had seen them regularly enough the few times he had entered the camps, but it was the first time he had ever had to pretend to be on the other end. Their first aim had been to simply reach the medical tent. Without Wendy here, there would have been no one who could have recognized them. There shouldn't have been. That is, until he had walked past Mest. Mavis, he hissed, quietly enough so that Mest wouldn't hear as he continued to walk ahead. Did the illusion fall? No, it's still working, she whispered back. Both had to resist the urge to check behind them, but they could hear the sound of Mest following after them. How on earth did he notice? He wanted to swear. Just their luck that they would be spotted by one of their own at the worst possible time. Even if they found Nozomi immediately, they would have still needed to convince her to get them out of there before Mest could catch up. Nozomi was fast, but even she needed time if he sprung this on her. They didn't have much choice. They'd just have to hope Mest would keep quiet. Heading down into a narrow path, he carefully moved past a few people before slipping into an empty tent nearby. Knowing how busy this place was, he doubted it would stay that way for long, so he would have to deal with Mest quickly. As expected, Mest followed them in a few seconds later, carefully shutting the tent's entrance to keep the lot of them out of sight. The moment he was done, he turned to him with a confused look on his face, keeping his voice low as he spoke. "Aren't you meant to be heading to Alvarez? How on earth did you know it was me?" Ichigo growled out, doing his best to keep quiet too. Places like this had too many ears and too thin walls. This should have been perfect. "Oh, it was," Mest replied immediately. "Anyone else would have looked right over you. Problem is that you used that same disguise in the future. I guess even if events change, some things end up showing up anyway." Of course his future self had to have done a similar thing. Since Mavis was the one making the illusion, it pretty much meant that any differences between him and his future self wouldn't impact the choice in disguise at all. And with how close Mest had been working with his future self, it would have been impossible for him not to have seen such a disguise. He did his best thought to avoid asking what his future self had used the disguise for. Some questions were better not knowing, especially with the questionable acts his future self may have committed. Never mind that right now. I'm in a rush. Can you get Nozomi and bring her here? I can't risk staying here for long. Of course, but why? Mest paused, his eyes glancing at the Mavis. He almost did swear that time, knowing that the sight of him with someone else was going to cause questions if anyone saw through his disguise. Even if Mest recognized his, Mavis's was not one that would have ever been used, since she hadn't regained her body in the future to the best of his knowledge. But even if the illusion was new, it wouldn't be enough to fool Mest at all. He could already see the gears turning in the man's mind as he realized who was beneath the illusion, and what it meant for Mavis to be here with him. Gulping quietly, Mest turned on his heel before uttering a quick, "Wait here," as he rushed out. He hardly had to wait long, as Mest showed back up a few minutes later, looking fairly out of breath as he managed to squeeze out a few words. "Gone, mission, watching. One moment please. Where is she?" he asked after giving Mest a few moments to catch his breath. "This is urgent. Alvarez has been making suspicious movements, even though we should have a temporary ceasefire. Once she dropped you off, she was meant to investigate a few leads and then report back. Since she hasn't returned yet, I assume she is trying to find out as much of their plans as possible, so I don't know when she'll be back yet." "Damn," he muttered under his breath. "Any estimates?" "A few hours. Probably not until either Alvarez begins to act or sometime before then. I can give Hibiki a message to have her hurry back. Hold off on that for now," he said as he quickly cut Mest off. "I was hoping she'd be here, but I can't afford to wait around longer for her to return." "You never saw me, all right? You traveled back in time, didn't you?" Mest muttered, ignoring his attempts to try and get him to leave. "You, of all people, used Lumen Histoire. After being so against even considering it an option. There was no choice left. Oh, I know, I'm not criticizing you here," Mest was quick to point out. "I know the kind of futures one would want to escape from, though you don't seem different." Ichigo raised a hand and gestured to himself, causing Mest to let out a brief laugh. "It's not your appearance I'm talking about. It's your attitude. You don't seem that different from when you left." As if realizing what he had said, all humor drained from Mest's voice in exchange for cold realization. "Which I can only assume means you came from a very recent future. How far ahead?" "Around 5 days, but the hell awaiting is starts in 2. You wouldn't have come back if not for a situation like that," Mest muttered. "How can I help?" "It's fine, I have to hurry and dash." "I'm faster than you if you plan to keep your presence hidden," Mest stated without hesitation. "You know you can't afford to run around like normal, else you might draw the attention of the other Ukin, and both Zeref and Wywak are likely to act unfavorable to you if they realize you used Lumen Histoire." That's why you came here looking for Nozomi, since her magic could let you reach anywhere you want. Exactly. But with that option gone dash. I'm your next best option, Mest declared. You know that, and I know you were prepared to drag others into this if they could help. Let me. I may not be able to get you there as quickly as Nozomi, but I'll be a hell of a lot faster than anyone else. I took you from one battlefield to another, remember? We got to that fight late. Yeah, but we still made it there, Mest pointed out. But besides, you know where I've come from. I understand time travel. I'm already familiar with trying to pinpoint the causes and effects of events. Ignoring anything else, that has to be invaluable right now. It honestly was, he couldn't deny that. And Mest was right in that he couldn't afford to move around as freely as he could normally. But some things still bothered him. What were you planning to do in the next 2 days? Do you have any orders? None in particular, Mest replied, catching on quickly. The current plans we have are to prepare and react to the news we get on Alvarez's plans. Whatever the case, I am not a crucial piece to command right now. I was on your team for long enough that they will consider others over me for their plans if they want to guarantee reliability, and you know I'm not a proper fighter anyway. One-on-one I can hold my own well enough, but in the end I'm more of an assassin or a spy than anything else. My skills aren't needed right now, so my presence should not impact the future in any meaningful way. You can't say that for certain, Ichigo pointed out, but if you're sure. Mavis, can you maintain a copy of him at a distance? It'll be hard, but I think I should be able to, Mavis muttered. It's only one after all, but don't expect it to be up to my usual standard. At the very least I can listen in if someone talks to it and find out if you are needed at all. We can go from there if it looks like your actions are necessary to the timeline. You're sure it'll be fine? Well, it can't be worse than what's coming, Mavis pointed out. We can afford to take some risks here. Ichigo considered her words before pushing any remaining worries away and turned back to Mest. All right then. I hope you are prepared to travel quite far though. This is where we need to go. Protector of the Fairies. I have to say, I'm not one for archaeology. Just keep looking, Ichigo growled out, walking around the open stretch of land and looking for the signs of cracks in the earth. With the front lines still far away from this place, it meant they had free rein to explore, but he hadn't expected the place to look so different. For one, the terrain was quite different, rolling hills and a small lake near the horizon. The fighting must have really altered the landscape for it to look so different in the future, and right now it was proving a problem. He roughly knew where those pillars had been. But finding them now was harder when the landscape hid them like this. He couldn't simply blast away the ground in fear of setting one of the pillars off and starting a chain reaction, which meant all he could really do was try and search carefully to pinpoint where one of them would emerge. It would help if you told me what we are looking for, Mest called out, simply looking for weakened ground or unusual signs. You said these were pillars of some kind, right? Yeah. If they were exposed you wouldn't be able to miss them. They're tall, and give off a foul presence. You can't pick that up by any chance, can you? If I could, do you think we'd be searching like this? Ichigo asked in annoyance. Truth be told, it was bothering him how he couldn't sense a trace of them despite being this close. How deep were they buried that he couldn't pick them up? Or was there some mechanism in them that was hiding their presence? There was too many questions and not enough answers to go off. I should risk getting in contact with Jura. I'm sure he could have sensed their structure beneath the earth. Their structure? I have an idea, Mest called out. Can you find where you believe one should be buried? As exact as possible. Ichigo nodded, continuing to look around until he was sure he had reached the point where one of the pillars would emerge from in the future. Here. Or around here at least. Mest nodded, walking over before crouching down and placing a hand against the ground and closing his eyes. Earth, 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 rock, rock dash. What are you doing? Looking for an open space, Mest muttered back. Teleporting somewhere blind is never a good idea, but it is doable. And if there is something down there, there must be some space at least. I just need to find it, so I'm using my magic to test the space. Not having much luck yet though, this thing must be deep and... Huh. You found something? Mest nodded. I think so. I didn't get a response just then, which means something stopped my magic from returning. Let me check around it to see if I can get us down there. Mest repeated his actions a few more times, a frown crossing his brow each time before he finally have the signal for Ichigo to grab on. With one final pulse of magic to check it was still safe, Mest teleported all three of them down and immediately then found themselves plunged into darkness. Well, isn't this pleasant, Mavis muttered, holding up a hand and forming an orb of golden light to fill the room with. Their eyes had to strain for a moment to adapt before the sight of the pillar drew their full focus. And there it is. So it really was hiding down here. It doesn't seem to be active at all though, Ichigo noted, stepping forward and raising a hand to it, almost allowing it to touch the pillar before hesitating. What activates it? Do you see a control switch or some sort of mechanism around here? How did it even reach the surface like the rest anyway? It looks like it might extend, suggested Mavis as she eyed the structure at a distance. It looks much shorter than the ones we saw. When activated it might rise to the surface and form the height we are familiar with, and doing so could cause whatever is sealing the foul presence away to be allowed to leak out. The activation mechanism though doesn't seem to be anywhere obvious. Perhaps it's internal. Looks like it, Ichigo muttered as he walked around the whole pillar. It would be easy to destroy it right now, but would they stop the problem? And even then it is only one of them. There has to be hundreds of them. Finding them all would be an impossible task. We barely knew where this one was. True. And if there are safeguards in place they might activate regardless, putting us in the same situation as before. Exactly. Hey Mest, what do you think? Silence greeted him, causing him to look at Mest, who appeared to be in a bit of a trance as he stared up at the face of the woman etched into the pillar. Mest. I've seen that face before, Mest muttered hesitantly. Somewhere. Where was it? That woman looks familiar to you. Yes. On a painting once, though I can't quite remember where. But these pillars and that face. I should have realized sooner. This is Face. Face. Ichigo frowned. The name itself was familiar, but why was it? Wait, you don't mean Dash. The last weapon that the Magic Council had left to play. A final deterrent, meant to stop any foe that was great enough to threaten the safety of the magic world in its entirety. A weapon to bring down giants and gods, and make them mortal men. That is Face. The Magic Council was developing magical barrier particle weapons. Ichigo hissed out. How long? Under whose orders? Magical barrier particles? No, that's not how Face works, stressed Mest. I've read the reports and even seen Face in action. It's a scattering device. Upon activation, it forcefully expels magic from all sources within its nearby vicinity before scattering the magic in all directions. Even a Quincy would find it impossible to bring any of that power under control in such conditions, but I can assure you it was not a magical barrier particle weapon. You saw it in action. Mest nodded. Yes. I remember it. Wait. Hold on. That's not right. Mest let a hand rest against his face as he tried to think carefully. Why did I even see Face? I want to know that too if you don't mind, said Mavis as she glared at Mest. From what we know of you, you weren't exactly in that kind of role in the Magic Council. Your deal was with spying and infiltration, and sometimes even assassination, so why were you there to see the activation of Face, a project that should really be for research and development teams? I don't know, Mest muttered. I remember these memories but... Tampered? When? Mest. Ichigo asked in concern. What's wrong? Someone's messed with my memories, Mest stated urgently. There are memories here that are wrong. I thought you would have recovered all your memories once you stopped playing the double role as Doran Bolt. I did too. I went through carefully, restoring each and every one of my memories that were sealed or hidden or faked. But the touch on these memories, this isn't my work. It's even more subtle. No wonder I missed them. I'm not missing memories from this time, they've just been altered slightly in such a way that I wouldn't notice unless I actively searched for this level of deception. It's like hiding memories in plain sight. But that still means you saw face when you shouldn't have. I know, Mest muttered worriedly, reaching for the scythe on his back. Hold on, I'm going to forcefully unravel this. I may scream a bit but don't worry about that. This is merely going to hurt a lot. Bracing himself, Mest raised his scythe before stabbing it into his chest, letting out a cry of pain as his mind was filled with memories. With each passing one he felt his eyes widen in horror, a film only visible to him being plain without any ability to escape from it until he was left lying on the ground crying, Ichigo crouching over him worriedly. I remember, Mest stated urgently. I saw it. Face's true activation. Magical barrier particles. It's all in there. And I killed everyone who worked on them. Someone wanted to keep things quiet, Mavis muttered. Who was it that gave you the orders? It was, no. I have to still be seeing things wrong. I'll try and look again and dash. The name. Mavis demanded. Who ordered the construction of these pillars? Who ordered you to kill the people who worked on them afterwards? Who altered your memories? The magic chairman, Mest muttered. It was Juoshiro. So he's involved, growled Mavis. Explains why the construction of new pillars could be kept secret in this day and age. With his influence in the Magic Council as its chairman, he could suppress information where necessary and ensure the work could be done in secret. Do we think he might have been a member of Avatar? A member of Avatar? Ichigo muttered in disbelief. It didn't seem likely at all to him. He knew Juoshiro. Had known him since he was a kid, and while the man was willing to dirty his hands he certainly wasn't one to bring about the end of the world as we knew it. No. The Juoshiro I know wouldn't be a part of such a group. It's more likely that he was trying to utilize the magical barrier particles as a last resort weapon. Which means he'll know who else would have access to them. There is still the architect to worry about as well, so it doesn't mean Juoshiro is the one that pressed the button to turn these things on. Architect? Mest asked in confusion. For what? The faces on the pillars, Ichigo said as he pointed up at the one before them. Aoyasu believes they were all made by the same person. Someone who has managed to live for a long time now and has been remaking her image for thousands of years. Do you remember seeing who did that in your memories? Mest shook his head. No, this part was always done by the time I arrived. But I said before I had seen this face elsewhere. She was in a painting I saw once in Juoshiro's office. Ichigo dash. It can still be a coincidence, Ichigo replied in denial. Do you really think Juoshiro would do something like this anyway? He's our friend. Come now, just go down. If I wanted to kill you, you'd be dead already, you know. And really, I don't like the idea of doing that to you of all people. Ichigo swallowed, doubt rising up inside him. Mimi Hagi's actions towards him flashed through his mind one after the other. The odd looks he had been given. The words said to him. The knowledge he seemed to have of him. And then there's you. The self-proclaimed protector, whose idea of saving involves self-sacrifice. The man who would throw his childhood away for the sake of those unable to comprehend the destruction their actions bring. It can't be, Ichigo muttered, the images of the man he knew and the enemy flashing before his eyes. There had been something familiar about Mimi Heiji from the start, but it was only now that he was recognizing why. Mimi Heiji had looked similar to someone else he already knew. No, I'm jumping to conclusions. He has to be involved in some way, Ichigo, Mavis said firmly. You know that, and we can't afford to risk giving him the benefit of the doubt. How odd. I wasn't expecting any of you. Did the kami cake miss you? Or is this simply too far afterwards to have been picked up by it? A single word stuck out in his mind. A single word he hadn't have time to recognize back then. Kami cake. The word Mimi Heiji said, Ichigo muttered out weakly. Kami cake. Mavis, we never found mention of it in the Holy Palace, did we? She didn't need to answer him. They both were coming to the same conclusion. That word doesn't exist, Ichigo continued, as if hoping someone would jump in and tell him how wrong he was just so he didn't have to be right. It isn't in any library or even in magic's realm of understanding, and yet we heard it before we even entered those doors. On a letter left for only me to find. I'm sorry, Ichigo, Mavis muttered, and he knew she meant it. He just wished that helped right now. Only 2 people in the world had used that word before. Mimi Heiji was the second. But the first was the one he hadn't wanted to believe was involved in all of this. And certainly one he hadn't wanted to believe was this responsible. It was him the entire time, wasn't it? Ichigo muttered sadly. The second host body. It's Juoshiro. He's Mimi Heiji. Protector of the fairies. The man behind the curtain. It was hard to keep his magical power in check, Ichigo noticed as he stormed his way through the corridors of the base of the War Council. He was trying his best, but despite all that it still leaked out in his anger, and the result was causing the entire building to shake. He could feel the floor straining and cracking with each step he took, energy lasting out at the walls and pushing anything that could even be conceived as an obstacle out of the way as far as possible. "You can't be here without an appointment," one of the nearby guards said, rushing forward with a magic staff brandished at him. Such a weapon was hardly a threat, as was the guard himself. No sooner had he stepped closer had the weight of his magic hit the guard, and to his credit he managed to stay standing for a good second or two. After that, however, his eyes rolled into the back of his head and he collapsed to the ground, just like all the rest that he had passed so far that had tried to approach him. Some had been smart at least. They had known to get out of his way and flee, likely reporting his arrival to others. He was sure the Queen for one would have questions, but he wasn't here to answer them. His destination was elsewhere. Reaching the door to the office he knew belonged to Juoshiro, he didn't bother to try and open it and instead kicked it open, sending it flying off its hinges and shattered as it hit the far wall. The office Juoshiro had been given looked like he assumed it would have, even including a desk with what he assumed was a ton of reports and details about the different battles happening. And, as if waiting for him, the man himself stood to one side of the room, shooting a confusing glance at the remains of the door. "I thought you seemed angry about something," Juoshiro muttered, "but did you have to destroy my door? I won't be able to get any privacy here if people think the fact it's gone means it's fine to disturb me whenever they want, regardless of how busy I am." Shaking his head slightly, Juoshiro turned to face him and showed him that same smile he remembered so often from his youth. "Well, I suppose a hello is at least needed. What brought you here, Ichigo?" And so angrily at that. He didn't say anything in response, instead looking over the man with careful eyes. Juoshiro had a sword by his side, but then he had done ever since the war had begun, needing it for an emergency if he needed to protect himself for until help could arrive. Beyond that, his clothes looked the same as usual, well kept, and smartly dressed. All of that was meant to detract from Juoshiro's physical appearance, however. His hair was well kept and pulled back tidily, but in the process it couldn't hide the sunken checks or the bags under the man's eyes. Long sleeves covered his arms, but when he moved it was easy to realize that they were baggy for a reason, meant to hide the fact his limbs were far too thin. Ever since he had met Juoshiro in the ruins of the Magic Council, he had known the man had not been well. His illness had taken a greater hold on him, and even his magical power was pitiful in comparison to what it once was. Back then he had thought it was due to Juoshiro's fading physical condition. It never had been, had it? He was standing this close to the man and there was only a shred of magical power being released, but now he no longer could see it as a result of illness. It was more like what it had been with Levi and Laxus, their magical power dropping as their ability with magical barrier particles grew. The only real difference was the foulness. From Juoshiro he still didn't sense that. He seemed normal. He had always seemed normal. But he still remembered the difference it had been like when he went to the ruins of Juoshiro's home. Magical barrier particles had been there and it was only natural to assume Juoshiro had been taken based off that. But there was also the possibility that the man had simply left of his own accord and that his story of being held captive was a complete lie. How long? Juoshiro frowned at him, looking honestly confused. It was almost good enough to make him doubt anything he knew. To think he was wrong. "Ichigo, are you all right?" He slammed his fist against the wall, not even bothering to hide his anger. "How long have you been with Avatar?" "With Avatar? What are you talking about?" The name itself didn't appear to register to Juoshiro. How long had he been playing this role to not even flinch in the form of accusation? "Answer me, Juoshiro. How long?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Juoshiro replied, sounding almost patiently as he tried to calm him down. The man took a few steps towards him before he rested a hand against his arm, trying to do something to calm him down, he reckoned. What happened? It made him hate all of this more. Even now Juoshiro was showing a face that only one who cared about someone would show. Juoshiro wasn't being angry at his actions but instead concerned, as if there was some other cause that was making him lash out like this. Juoshiro honestly looked like he wanted to help him. And for a moment, he even believed it. The next Juoshiro was being thrown across the room, crashing into the side of his desk. Stop that, Ichigo growled angrily as Juoshiro clutched his chest in pain on the ground. He could even see a bit of blood that Juoshiro had spat up on the ground nearby. That act. Isn't it time you stopped it already? Ichigo. What's gotten into you? Honest eyes meet his own, eyes that were hardly the ones he had seen in the future on Mimi-Heiji. He crossed the distance between them slowly, watching as Juoshiro slowly struggled to get to his feet without looking away from him. I can help dash. I said stop that. He roared, grabbing Juoshiro by the front of his robes and slamming him against the desk. I asked you how long you were working with Avatar? Was it during those 7 years I was gone? Or was it longer? Were you a part of them when you met me? Ichigo. I swear, Juoshiro managed to gasp out. I don't know anything about Avatar. I'm not lying. Not even a flicker of doubt. You look like you're telling the truth. With that he swung Juoshiro across the desk's surface and let him crash against the wall. If I hadn't come to realize it myself, I would truly believe you right now. Juoshiro could only groan in pain, more blood having been thrown up from his impact against the wall. He ignored it though, briefly glancing at the papers on the desk. Nothing incriminating here at first glance. It looks all normal. Except I recognize this one, he said, pulling one of the sheets of paper up from the desk and glancing the formations on the map. I just came from there, you know. There aren't any battles happening there right now, and yet you have plans ready for when one takes place. I have them, for more places, than just there. Juoshiro wheezed out. Alvarez is preparing for something. Our lines may fall, and need to regroup. These are some of the many places we can hold. It sounds reasonable, Ichigo muttered. You would be the type to prepare for this. And I honestly want to believe you, he added before scrunching the paper up into a ball and throwing it over his shoulder. An act so good it appears like reality itself. But it won't work. Not when you're the one who told me about the kami cake. The kami cake? Asked Juoshiro in confusion. Ichigo, you must have the wrong idea. It's all part of a plan, right? You once said it was a means of predicting the future, but I don't think I remember you ever explaining how it worked. What do you do? Reach out to Mimi-Heiji directly and get guidance from him? Is that why you were so compatible with him? Mimi-Heiji. You know his name. He crossed the distance in a blink of an eye, and before Juoshiro had time to reach he was finding himself being dragged across the wall and shoved out a window, held only by the front of his clothes. I'm not playing around here, Juoshiro. If you know his name, then you know there is no way I could believe anything you said now. If you won't tell me how long you've been involved with him in Avatar, then tell me how you plan to activate Face. Do that and I'll only shove you in a cell. I won't kill you. Please Ichigo, calm down. Juoshiro cried out, trying not to move too much in case it caused him to fall from Ichigo's grasp. Just pull me inside and we can dash. Oops, Ichigo stated as he purposefully loosened his grip, causing Juoshiro to begin to fall before he grabbed him again just as he began to cry out in fear. Let's try again. The method. Calm down, Ichigo. Don't do this. I'm not kidding here, Juoshiro, Ichigo said as he loosened his grip once more. One more time, or I'll drop you. And unless you drop this act, I'm sure you won't survive a fall from this height. Now, tell me how to stop Face. Alright. Juoshiro spat out hastily, being thrown inside and across the floor the moment he agreed. Taking a few deep breaths, he barely had time to rest before he was spun over and held to the ground by a foot. Talk. Face is our last deterrent, reserved to a situation where the threat of a magical enemy is so vast that they could destroy the entire world. A last resort weapon to bring them down to our level for as long as magic is scattered for. Ichigo pressed down with his foot harder, causing a cry of pain from Juoshiro. Don't lie to me. I know what face is. It's a weaponized bomb of magical barrier particles, stretching into the thousands. Ichigo, believe me, you're wrong. I'm not. But if you want to play like this, tell me how to stop it. And this time don't try and lie. Just calm down and I'll tell you. Juoshiro exclaimed desperately. You don't need to stop it because there isn't a single person who can activate it alone. I'm telling the truth. Juoshiro cried out as the pressure on his chest increased. Explain. Now. It's keyed to individuals, Juoshiro wheezed out between breaths. Old members of the Magic Council, along with me. Together we form a seal preventing its usage. And you can bypass it, of course. No. It's not possible. The safeguards. The safeguards didn't stop you from being able to fire Ethereum by yourself, Ichigo snarled. I remember. You used me as a means of transferring your authorization protocols and were able to fire Ethereum from that alone. Ethereum doesn't have the same safeguards in place. A vote is typically necessary, but in times of crisis the decision to fire lies in the hands of the chairman if they are willing to pay the cost of such unauthorized actions. And you expect me to believe the same isn't true of Face in this case? Ichigo spat out angrily. Let me guess how it would go down. With a single command to an archive screen you can trigger all of the Face devices remotely? Am I wrong? Yes. It's not even in my control anymore. It's linked to Super Archive. And now you move to deflection, Ichigo snarled out. Trying to make me doubt myself and cast my suspicions on Hibiki. But I already know about you, Juoshiro, so that won't work. You've had Super Archive once, before you passed it to the next magic chairman. If there was a magic means to leave a backdoor, I'm sure it would have been found by now. But if it was corrupted in a different way, permanently damaged by magical barrier particles, well, I'm positive you could still activate it remotely if given the chance. In one swift move he drew the shorter blade of his Zanpakuto and held it against Juoshiro's throat. And then he hesitated at the fear on Juoshiro's face. He was right, wasn't he? He hadn't made a mistake? Since the beginning here Juoshiro hadn't shown anything but his usual self. His actions and expressions were not of someone angry or upset about their ruse being found, but of an old man unable to understand why someone he considered a friend was doing these things to him. It almost made him take his blade away in shame. If he was wrong. If it had never been Juoshiro, this guilt would never fail. He would have beaten a dying man for answers he didn't have. But Juoshiro had known things. Kami Cake, Face, he knew of all of them. He even recognized the name of Mimi Heiji, and to have been his host it meant he had already fallen into his clutches long ago. Juoshiro was dangerous. Even so, he didn't want to kill him. I'll keep my word, he said, before drawing his blade back and sheathing it. Juoshiro had only a moment to look relieved before he slammed a fist into the man's face, knocking his head against the ground and sending him straight to a forced sleep. There were places he could hide Juoshiro away. Right now a normal cell would not hold him. There was too much risk that he might be released before he had time to explain the danger Juoshiro represented. Though if he left now, it would look like he was the guilty one. He could already hear noise coming from the corridor. No doubt it was some of the more elite mages on site coming to investigate the disturbance and try and ask him to leave. They'd be fools to try and force him. He glanced over towards the window, confirming it would be large enough to get them both out that way, before his senses picked up the tiniest trace of it. Compared to the vast amount of magic all around it, it was like a grain of sand. But it sent alarm bells ringing through his body. He hardly saw it. One arm came up to block, prepared for whatever weak strike was coming from that foul power, and then suddenly he found himself flying through the air, blood in his throat and pain across his back from where he had been thrown through the wall. What the dash? He never even had time to finish his words, the sky turning dark above him before it appeared to fall right down against him, knocking him from the sky and into the earth. Only after it hit did he realize it was only magical barrier particles, packed so densely together and in such large amounts that it had blocked out everything else. Getting to his feet was hard after a blow like that. Every bone in his body ached, and it felt like his legs would give way at any minute. The magic in the air was being used in combination with his own to hasten his recovery, but the sheer amount of magical barrier particles now lingering in the air made it hard for magic to reach him. "Don't worry, you won't die from any of that," came a voice so dangerously familiar. He could feel his blood freezing from shock which slowly morphed to terror as he turned towards the voice to see the very man he had just knocked unconscious strolling towards him without a care in the world. "I was just returning the favor for the beating you gave Juashiro." This presence. These words. That look. No. No, 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 no. Oh? You look scared, Ichigo. Juashiro, no. This wasn't Juashiro. The one before him was the one saying these words as he walked closer towards him, a smirk on his face. "It's only been a short while since we last met, although for me it is the first true meeting I have had with you." This wasn't possible. He should still have time. It hadn't even been a full day yet. There was still plenty of time until this man was meant to appear. "Ichigo? Are you all right?" His hands clenched into fists at those words, seeing the look on the man's face as they were spoken. Those were the same words Juashiro had asked him. Even the tone was the same. The expression, however. This man knew what he was doing to make him angry. "You shouldn't be able to be here." "But I am," stated the man before him. "But then hadn't you been prepared for such a possible when you stormed into my office?" "That's Juashiro's office." "You aren't him." "Then who am I?" the man asked, tilting his head with a mocking smile across his face. "Go on. Say it. Tell me who I am. Isn't it obvious?" He crossed the distance immediately, hoping to have distracted the man long enough with his words to let his guard down. Without hesitation he reached for the larger of his two blades from his back and swung it down with a roar. "Mimi Heiji." Ah. It's so nice, hearing one's own name after so long. Mimi Heiji didn't even flinch at the sight of the blade beside him, Ichigo staring at the empty space in shock for a moment before his right side opened up in a spurt of blood. Immediately he tried to back off, unsure of how Mimi Heiji had even gotten him with that blow. Eyeing Mimi Heiji warily, he didn't see any weapon on him. All the man had was the magical barrier particles, but if shaped correctly he didn't doubt that they could be used to hurt him that badly. But when had Mimi Heiji even moved? He had to have dodged right into the path of his blade and somehow ducked beneath it before hitting him in the process. And yet he hadn't seen anything until Mimi Heiji came to a stop. Carefully toughing his side with his free hand, he growled in frustration at how slow the healing process was going. It was slower than normal, and he could feel the touch of the magical barrier particles against his skin as they tried to force any and all magic away. They were far more tenacious than the magical barrier particles he was used to. "Hey, address me again, won't you?" "Huh?" he asked in annoyance, noticing the happy look Mimi Heiji appeared to have on his face. "What the hell are you talking about?" "I suppose it doesn't make sense to you," Mimi Heiji admitted. "And the me you know probably was a bit annoyed. The presence of multiple Ukin will do that to you. But right now, the me of now wants to savor moments like this. Of hearing your own name. How egocentric do you have to be to love that so much? You have a cult of followers worshipping you." "Ah yes, Avatar," Mimi Heiji muttered. "A useful bunch all things considered, and so easy to motivate. Never personally mind you. A precious relic here, an ancient text there, this stuff is so easy to make so long as it has my presence on it. With items alone it is so easy to guide them to my will, but I never actual met them myself. And even if I did, having my name worshipped is a bit much honestly. No," Mimi Heiji added with a smile. "What I want is to merely hear my name as a person, not as a god or mythical being. Say it with as much hate as you want, or say it like the name itself is dirt. I hardly care about the context so long as I can be addressed, as I have not had such a luxury in eons." "You won't say it?" asked Mimi Heiji after a few moments of silence. "Hold on, I can fix that." This time Ichigo noticed something, if only briefly. Mimi Heiji sped towards him, practically a blur to his eye, and he immediately swung out. This time his blade made contact, and for a moment he actually thought that was a good thing. Until he couldn't pull it back, Mimi Heiji maintaining a strong grip on it as magical barrier particles began to spread around the blade, cracking it. Let me just borrow this a moment. He hardly had time to work out what Mimi Heiji meant by that before he felt pain blossom at his shoulder, his right arm severed cleanly away by magical barrier particles. He immediately leaped back, abandoning his sword now that he had lost his whole grip on it before suddenly Mimi Heiji was before him once more, his leg snaking behind his and causing him to trip. A glint of metal caught his eye briefly before his own sword was brought down against him, stabbing through his chest and pinning him to the ground. Now that's better, Mimi Heiji said as he began to curse the man's name, much to the man's glee. See, even this is fine. Hate aimed at me personally. It's so nice rather than the whole universal hate I've had aimed at me for, well, I hardly remember how long ago it was when it started. It's a nice change. I'm going to kill you. Huh? Oh, sure, Mimi Heiji said as he leaned against the part of his blade still sticking up out of his chest, using it as a post to cling to as he rested one hand around the hilt. Best of luck with that. I can hardly fault you for wanting to try, though excuse me if I don't take your words seriously. I would, but I mean, well, you're down there at my feet. Screw you. He snarled out, gripping his own blade and trying to force it up. If he could even pull it out a bit, enough to release it from the ground, he could break free. Unfortunately Mimi Heiji's strength was simply too much, his attempts doing nothing. You should be happy about this, Mimi Heiji joked. Trust me, most people in this situation usually aren't able to hate me. Well, that's because I normally kill them so they never have the chance, but this is the better of two options, Ichigo. So I'd stop struggling if I was you. I'm holding back right now, but I won't if you decide to try anything dangerous. Like your Bankai, of course, though I'm sure you must be tempted knowing it would alert all of your fellow Ukin to the fact there are currently two of you. Two of him. How did Mimi Heiji know? Wait, what had Mimi Heiji said earlier? That it had only been a short while since they last met? The Mimi Heiji that he knew and the Mimi Heiji of now? They'd assumed the Mimi Heiji of the future had been destroyed once exposed to the raw presence of the world's magic, but that wasn't the case, was it? You're the one from the future. The same one that ended the world. Correct. And wrong. Which the hell is it? It's both, Mimi Heiji said casually. But of course it is also neither. I can hardly be considered the same as I was before, nor can I truly be the one you encountered. Time travel is a pretty interesting thing, but what's interesting is how the paradox effects of encountering one's own self alter when dealing with spiritual elements over physical ones. Especially when in a realm where the binds of time aren't so strict and the laws of magic are long since gone. Would you like to know what happened? Mimi Heiji asked. I'll tell you if you wish. Most of my consciousness always resides in a single place, cut off from the world itself and unbound by the magic that rules all else. It's a place where nothing else exists, nothing else can live, and only I can be found there, alone for an eternity in a void of silence. It's been so long that I am not even sure if it was something I created or something I took over, but ever since the day I lost my physical form and was banished from this world, I have resided there ever since. And every time I crossed back over, magic would always push me back bit by bit. It doesn't matter what time period I'm from, the same will always apply so long as magic senses my presence. So imagine my surprise when another me entered that realm. There could only be one of us. The very interaction caused a paradox, as it would interfere with how that me from the future even encountered the me of the present. But rather than one of us being erased, instead we merged. Our spiritual nature meant it was the easiest way for time to fix the paradox, and so our memories merged together, and I saw those extra days. A mad smile slowly crossed Mimi Heiji's face, his eyes practically sparkling with glee as he began to laugh with joy. And what an incredible sight it was. I knew it was coming. My work, the messages I brought about, it all is part of my plan. Peeking into the world, observing events that are occurring and the events that will occur in some cases, all thanks to the power I developed in my isolation. The kami cake. But even that pales in comparison to the memories I saw. It's one thing to know your plan is working. It's another to see it come to fruition, to see the dream you have wished for finally come to life. I honestly have to thank you for that, Mimi Heiji said as he glanced down at him. Thanks to you, I got to see a glimpse of my victory and my first true steps on this earth once more. True steps. Ah. Curious. You said it yourself, Ichigo spat out. Magic rejects you. It pushes you out of this world. So how are you here now? No, how long have you been in this world? How long have you been hiding in Juoshiro's skin? Was he even aware? Aware, in a sense, Mimi Heiji stated. The moment you started trying to get answers out of him, I had a feeling I knew what you were thinking. A sleeper agent, a prepared host, a well-practiced actor in playing the role you knew him as, there are countless possibilities but none were me. Because no matter what, he didn't have the same presence. If he did, he would have been found out long ago. You convinced yourself that until my revival that he was only a piece you could remove from the board and lock away somewhere safe. Even kill if necessary. Ah yes, said Mimi Heiji as he eyed the flinch he made. I saw it. You were prepared to kill Juoshiro. If there had even been the slightest trace of me that you had sensed at the time, I'm sure you would have felt the pressure from all the magic around you demanding his death. And even without anything to confirm me, you were still prepared to take the risk. But you couldn't. You withdrew your blade before I needed to step in. I wasn't going to kill him if I could stop him. Mimi Heiji nodded. And that is why I was able to wait so long. You asked how long I have been hiding in Juoshiro's skin, correct? The answer. Well, it is better to say that I have been there so long that Juoshiro would have hardly remembered a time where my influence wasn't a part of him. It's an old story, mind you, Mimi Heiji said fondly, but is how he and I met. He was only 3, so young and yet already marked for the end. The medicine of today is not what it was then, and even with the advances made, so much fueled by the funding he helped push into such research when he was the magic chairman, I'm sure the disease would still be fatal. Internal organs are quite a delicate thing, and the lungs are especially precious. Almost everyone had given up hope, explained Mimi Heiji, placing a hand against his chest. These lungs were failing, and even the best doctors available could do nothing. Juoshiro's family wasn't exactly poor by any means, but they were prepared to spend every last penny if it meant saving his life. But money can't buy everything. So they turned to magic. And when that failed them, when all the healers they found couldn't heal the damage, they turned to faith. They prayed to every god imaginable, from the well-known ones of this age to ones long since forgotten. They even prayed to fake gods, spoken only in rumors and stories from the past who I can confirm never existed. And then, one day, I heard it. My name. You were watching them, weren't you? Ichigo shot out. Maybe they noticed. Ah, my mistake, Mimi Heiji said as he quickly corrected himself. I'm telling this like I was there for all of it, when in reality most of what I know is what I learned from Juoshiro's memories and what I saw from his family once they drew my attention. Normally I don't hear my name that often. The regulars are Avatar, unknowingly making contact through the very relics of my power left behind in this world. But over time I grew used to ignoring such calls. I wasn't interested in talking to such people. Which was why I found myself so intrigued by when I heard my name, not spoken out of awe or worship, but out of desperately. And what did I see, Mimi Heiji added, but a boy destined for death and his family pleading for his life. I'll admit that I am unsure of where they even found the relic they used to contact me. Pure luck perhaps. But even so, they found it and were using it to beg to me. Not for power, not out of greed, not for destruction, not for pain, not for anything I was so used to hearing. All they wished for, all they pleaded for, was for the life of their son. For him to live a long and happy life. If I could do that, they'd pay any price. Glancing at himself, Mimi Heiji allowed a fond smile to show for a moment. I've never been asked something like that. For so long my name has been the source of hatred. I am the devil in the world of magic, the foulest being that can ever be, and here I was being pleaded with like I was the beloved god. Maybe it was merely a whim. Maybe it was because I wanted to do what magic could not. But I wanted to save that child. So I manifested, Mimi Heiji added, much to Ichigo's horror. Surprised are you? I have always been capable of it. However, without a physical host my presence can last for only mere moments. Using the relic the boy's parents had found as a catalyst, I bought myself enough time to save the boy's life, but from the moment I had decided to do it I had known there was only going to be one way. Just because I want to help you see, it doesn't mean I could heal Juoshiro. I figured, Ichigo muttered, still trying to subtly move the sword when he thought Mimi-Heiji wasn't noticing. The longer he kept Mimi-Heiji talking like this, the more likely he'd let his guard down or let something slip. If you had healed him, he wouldn't have ever been ill when I met him. Exactly, agreed Mimi-Heiji. But for the means I had at my disposal, it was possible to at least delay the inevitable. To halt it, freezing it in place or rather slowing it down close to a standstill. So long as my power kept the disease in his lungs in check, he would live. What was days left for him turned into decades thanks to me. But you only delayed it. He was always dying, just now he was dying slowly. But only as long as your power was there. If you leave him, nothing would be holding his disease back. For him, that is a sad truth, Mimi-Heiji agreed. I couldn't merely use my power. Magic would wipe it away with me and kill him, regardless of whether he meant to come into contact with my power on such an intimate level. So if I couldn't stay, then I merely had to take what I needed with me. I reached into his body and took hold of his lungs, and as I was pulled away I took them with me. I forced a bridge between us with those lungs in the middle, allowing my power to always be in contact with him without magic realizing. Well, almost without it realizing, Mimi-Heiji added in disgust. It took magic quite some time to realize he was in contact with my power, and like those who come into contact with magical barrier particles and actively use them, it slowly stripes away its help. But Juoshiro wasn't even aware he was using my power. He was punished because I was helping him live, because in magic he was better off dead if he needed my help. Waving a hand out, Mimi-Heiji emphasized his next words with a wave of magical barrier particles ripping the ground apart beside them. So I lashed out myself. I was content to just wait around until Juoshiro died at a nice age, but if magic decided it was going to hasten that, then I would have Juoshiro help me in turn. I have never had a host before that wasn't burnt out by my power, but the bridge between us meant I didn't need to fully cross over. I could influence him from my side, and at times like now I could even act with limited freedom. And in this state, even magic cannot truly recognize me. Oh, it knows someone is here, Mimi-Heiji pointed out. But it can't work out what? It thinks I'm merely a foolish soul using a warped power or something, and so begins to exert its will at a much slower rate. And when I retreat back, not even a trace remains. Not a single one of you who can ever could realize, even standing right in front of me. Even Ichibe, the one who should be able to recognize me, only frowned when he first met me. The things I have been able to do in one lifetime thanks to Juoshiro are more than I ever did in 100. The best part is that Juoshiro's own goals helped further my own, said Mimi-Heiji, with a smile that looked almost proud on his face. Over the years I gave him nudges here and there, but he chose to become the magic chairman of his own free will. The pull I had in such a role was far more than I had ever had, and the pawns I gained let me increase the production of face and do in years what took centuries myself. And I really do owe a lot to that pawn Makarov sent into my service. Doran Bolt was such a wonderful helper, once his memories were sufficiently altered, of course. Juoshiro knew how to do the touches, though not really why he was doing it. Only that it was an action he needed to take to fulfill the kami cake. Juoshiro saw that wasteland, and wanted it. It wasn't something Ichigo wanted to believe. But if Juoshiro had been twisted by this man from his childhood, then... No, Mimi-Heiji said, interrupting Ichigo from his thoughts as he heard what sounded like regret in the man's voice. The kami cake showed him many things, but he wasn't me. He wouldn't want the same goals, but he realized war was coming, though the brief glimpses he got. Perhaps he did see that wasteland, but he wouldn't have known the cause and would have been desperate to do anything to avoid the casualties this war has brought. Believe it or not, many of his decisions have been thanks to the things I showed him, and thousands of lives have been saved as a result. Only it hardly matters when you plan to kill everyone anyway, Ichigo shot back at Mimi-Heiji. Because of what you do, everyone dies. Don't mistake that as something I am happy about, Mimi-Heiji replied, adding a bit of force to the blade and undoing all of Ichigo's work to try and get it freed. If people die, they will die. If they live, they will live. What I seek is the destruction of magic. If you want to blame anyone for their deaths, blame magic for tying itself so heavily to your lives. I didn't want it to go this way, you have to understand, explained Mimi-Heiji, almost patiently as if he was trying to convince him that he was right in his goals. I tried to use other means. During one life so long ago I weakened the barriers between our world and another so much that magic leaked though, and I was hoping one day that all of magic would be drained into that world where it would be easier to destroy entirely. But magic resisted, always trying to get back here. Its will was too strong, and so the Edalas project became a failure. I've had many failures over the years, but each one only solidifies my resolve. Face is the answer to that. The weapon to annihilate magic entirely, and to allow me to return to this world once again. But you have to be here to activate it, Ichigo pointed out. If Juoshiro dies here then I'll manifest in Baragan's body and use the limited time I have to slaughter the Ukin there and go on a rampage, stated Mimi-Heiji. You can't stop Ban Before he could even finish the word, Mimi-Heiji slammed a fist into his face, disrupting his focus as he was forced to spit out blood to one side. None of that, Mimi-Heiji warned. I won't kill you, but there are plenty of ways to keep you from resisting. That's odd, Ichigo said, chuckling briefly as he noticed Mimi-Heiji frowning. You won't kill me, huh? One of magic's precious Ukin is right before you and yet you're staying your hand? I'm the only threat to your plans and yet you won't kill me. I have no need to. Even if you did kill me, even if you delayed my plans and set me back 1,000 years, what would it matter? I won once already. The memories alone can keep me going for thousands of years if necessary. As it stands, I have nothing to fear even if I fail. So you say, Ichigo shot back. But if I'm being honest right now, you should really want to kill me. So who is stopping you, huh? Stopping me? Ah. I did wonder, Mimi-Heiji muttered. Juoshiro. He's ever so soft, despite the cruelty he is capable of. No wonder I didn't kill you in the future with the others. Even I found my actions odd, but it was because he's my host. Juoshiro doesn't want you to die, and therefore I can't kill you. How fascinating. Even now I learn new things in this bond one have. I wonder how much of it will remain once Juoshiro passes. Perhaps once he becomes my host in its entirely, he won't ever. Now then, what to do with you, Mimi-Heiji asked. I could easily tear off your limbs and keep yourself from regenerating until face activates, but the result of that would have you die after magic dies, so I'm loath to do that. I guess there really is only one alternative. Doran Bolt. As if the name itself was a trigger, the man himself appeared beside Mimi-Heiji, a blank look on his face with his eyes glazed over. He doesn't say much like this, Mimi-Heiji revealed as he noticed Ichigo's expression. But he's such a loyal servant. I'll stop you. Mark my words, I'll stop you. Go ahead, Mimi-Heiji replied back at the challenge. I welcome it. But if you want to stop me, then first make your way back. Maybe you will wake up in time to stop me. Wake up? Don't you Until the next time we meet, Mimi-Heiji said, placing a fist in front of Ichigo's face as magical barrier particles started to coat it. And at the very least make it entertaining. Juoshiro always held you in such high esteem, so I hope you can meet my expectations too. I want your last stand to be glorious. Without giving Ichigo any time to resist, Mimi-Heiji raised his fist once more and slammed it back down, and then Ichigo knew no more, his vision fading into darkness. Protector of the Fairies. The rightful king of magic. Struggling along with the body, Doran Bolt heaved it up higher on his back as he struggled against the harsh winds. Narrowing his eyes slightly, he focused on the peak within his range and teleported, landing on a small ridge near the top. With his destination in sight, he let out a sigh of relief, hastily carrying Ichigo into the opening and towards the darkness within. Fiddling quickly in his pockets, he managed to find the light source he had brought for this very reason before shining it down into the passageway, trying not to flinch at the opposing statues in this place. It wasn't a natural place. He had felt that way the one other time he had been here, when his master had shown him this place in case it was needed in the future. From the words he had been told, it was the birthplace of the magical barrier particles, the place where Mimi-Heiji had suffered in anguish before finally turning against the entire world. Perhaps that was why it felt so alive right now, as if sensing the one he was carrying on his back and screaming out for his blood. The walls themselves seemed to move, shifting ever so slightly whenever the light from his torch passed over them, and it almost seemed like eyes were following him as he walked. He had nothing to fear though. Not so long as he was under the protection of his master. Wait. Who was his master? He groaned lightly, raising a hand to his head momentarily as he tried to block out the pain. There was something he was forgetting. Something was wrong. Why was he taking Ichigo here? What had Ichigo done? Hell, what had he done? He couldn't remember the past few hours. A wave of panic washed over him and he was half prepared to turn around now and get Ichigo out of here. But as he began to, he felt something brush against him, something that sent a jolt of pain through his mind before his doubts and worries settled, being pushed away. That was right. He was here because of his master's orders. That was all that mattered. He didn't need to question anything. He just had to do as he was told. Without any further hesitation he continued his slow pace into the caverns until he finally reached the doorway at the end. Perhaps once it had merely been a simple cave. Or maybe this had been built before this cave's presence was changed. All that mattered to him right now was that he was to put Ichigo in the jail cell ahead. The doorway opened at his touch, as if sensing his mission and trying to help fulfill it. All he had to do now was walk inside and place Ichigo's body on the ground. When Ichigo woke up, he'd find himself trapped in a cage more potent than any other in the world. So this was the plan, huh? Thanks, I'll take him from here. Doran Bold frowned as the weight on his back was immediately pulled away, turning around and shining the light towards the owner of the voice. It sounded familiar, almost as if it was his. Sorry about this, Mest said to his younger self, holding Ichigo by the back of his clothes as he set him down on the ground. His younger self still looked confused, not quite sure of what was happening. That made it easy for him to do his work when his scythe swung up from his other hand and sliced straight into him. If he had more time, he could have done a neater job. Perhaps saved Doran Bold some pain and even rid him of the terrible memories he knew he now had. But in a place like this, he couldn't afford to do that. Instead he let his magic seek out the very poison he knew was there, finding the manipulated memories and tearing away the barriers that kept them from his younger self along with the commands that switched him to that state of obedience. It was unsettling to hear himself scream. He had heard his own screams before, but normally he wasn't able to take notice of them properly through his own pain. Facing one's younger self was never a pleasant experience, he was quickly learning. We shouldn't stay here, he stated, alerting his companion to hurry up as he tried to focus on his own task. Can you wake him up? Give me a moment, Mavis muttered, a hand held against Ichigo's cheek as she closed her eyes. Mimi Heiji was smart. If we hadn't been on the lookout we might have missed your younger self entirely. I didn't think it was possible for our connection to be blocked like this without a large dosage of magical barrier particles, and yet Mimi Heiji managed to inject a thin layer of them into Ichigo to block me out long enough to ensure Doran Bold would reach here. It's impressive work. Ichigo's eyes snapped open, causing her to smile as she withdrew her hand, the golden energy coming off it dying down. But of course it's pretty easy to demolish from the outside if you are willing to brute force your way through it. That better, Ichigo? Much, Ichigo coughed out, clutching his injured side. Damn, I'd hoped that wound would have healed by now. Mimi Heiji must have been ensuring I wouldn't recover until I was locked away. Where are we anyway? Mavis shuddered. Somewhere not good. We should get out of here. This place doesn't like people like you, nor things like me. Agreed. Mest. I've got my younger self, Mest stated, his younger self falling unconscious and quickly being swung over his shoulder like a sack of potatoes. That too, but my sword. Mimi Heiji took it. The larger one at least. The shorter one broke apart before he could try and take that one too. My Edala's self was one step ahead, I see. I'll sort out a new larger blade later, though I can't say I don't wish I had it now, he muttered, the light from the fallen torch shining a path to the exit, along with illuminating the moving forms beginning to block the way out. Follow after me and don't stop for anything, he stated, letting Mavis clamber onto his back quickly before charging forward. The figures standing before him moved to stop him, weapons forming from the energy that infested the cave, but before they could strike he smashed his way through the center, unleashing a short-range Getchuga Tenshou to open up a path. Movement quickly caught his attention near the exit as the very opening began to close, causing the lot of them to rush for the exit. He saw Mest reappear ahead of him, just outside, and knew to go as fast as he could now that he didn't have to worry about the exit trying to hurry to block him and leave Mest trapped behind. As if sensing his intention, the darkness spread faster, but he managed to break through at the last moment, landing on the edge of the ridge and leaping straight off as Mest teleported after him. Sparing a look back, he noticed how the darkness seemed to be trying to chase. It couldn't get far, the magical barrier particles that made it all up being beaten back with every inch they made it out of the cave, until eventually it had no choice but to give up and retreat, becoming nothing more than a dot on the horizon as they continued to flee, not daring to stop until they were far enough away that they couldn't even see the mountain itself. "Please say that was worth it," Ichigo muttered as they all collapsed down on the ground, taking the time to let out sighs of relief that they had gotten away from that place with so little trouble. "I definitely don't want to go back there again." It felt a lot like the Holy Palace, Mavis mused. Perhaps it's the equivalent for magical barrier particles. I doubt it's to the same extreme. Mimi Heiji talked about existing in another plane of reality. But if that was where it all began for him, it could be a point where his energy can linger freely despite opposition. Or perhaps there is even a crack in reality there that his power manages to sneak through. "There's nothing there that we can access though," Mest muttered in annoyance. "We've lost a lot of hours. Was it even worth it?" "It gave us what we needed, even if it didn't go exactly how we planned," Ichigo revealed. "We know how Face is activated, and know something happens in relation to Super Archive. Though for Mimi Heiji to show up at this point in time, it wasn't something I'd accounted for." "It's not your fault," Mavis replied comfortingly. "For Mimi Heiji to have inhabited Juushiro in such a way was beyond our predictions. This is far more than simply taking over a host body. This is full-on integration. And our enemy happens to be one of the most dangerous men in the world," Mest growled out in frustration. "If Mavis hadn't filled me in on what she heard before your connection got shut off, I wouldn't even believe it. Juushiro's political power was bad enough, but add on that Mimi Heiji can be brought forth at any moment and we have someone capable of beating you." "No, he can't." Mest frowned as he turned towards Mavis. "Did you not see what we did? How many exchanges did they make in that fight? Hardly any, and at the end Ichigo was pinned by his own sword, with one arm less. And that arm still hasn't regrown." "I'm working on it," growled out Ichigo, trying to push back the magical barrier particles hindering his regeneration. "He's got good aim. If this wasn't a clean cut I'd have to deal with a lot more headache. If I can just push back the energy interfering I can have it regrown fully in a few hours from now." "Alright then, but you still lost. Even if you use Bankai you'll dash. Lose? Why? Why? Surely he can pull out far more power if this man is as powerful as you said him to be. Didn't he crush you before in your Bankai? I get that you were weakened, but even then you said the only thing that you could do was run." "I know. And if I was facing Mimi Heiji then running would be the only option." "Then why dash?" "Because that isn't just Mimi Heiji," Ichigo declared. "How to put this? Mavis. 50-50. Ichigo shook his head. "Much lower. If I had to guess at how much power Mimi Heiji can draw out, 20%. 20%. Mest muttered in confusion. 20% of what? His total strength. You can't be serious. Ichigo nodded. Deadly. Mimi Heiji fought over at least 100 Ukin at his peak, all at once. He reduced their numbers down to a mere fraction of that before being finally beaten, and even then he wasn't even killed permanently if he's still around now. He was reduced to a mere spirit, a shade of his former self, and the only way he can exert his strength in his world is through a host. So if there is a limiting factor at all, it's the host. Mest finished for him. And with Juushiro's weakened physical state, that's not much of an issue for Mimi Heiji, Mavis pointed out. Compatibility is far more important. With how long Mimi Heiji has been a part of Juushiro, I don't think there is anyone more compatible with him. Not even a Nukin like Avatar's attempt with Baragan. However, at the end of the day, that is a borrowed body, Ichigo added as Mavis looked towards him. It's not his original one. No matter how compatible it is with him, he should only be able to draw so much out at once so long as most of his essence remains outside of this realm. And the more he exerts his presence, the more magic will react and push him back. If he can pull out more than 20% of his total strength, it will be at the cost of losing Juoshiro as his host from that point onwards. If it's only 20%, I think I can beat him with my Bankai. And if it's over that, I can outlast him. Or at least stall long enough to win that way. I'm sensing a but here, Mest muttered as he noticed the frown Ichigo had on. What's the catch? Strength itself is important, but I don't think strength will matter here. Now when Juoshiro always has his finger on the trigger of face. In a way we're back to where we started, said Mavis, crossing her arms in thought. Even if we attack Mimi-Heiji, if he thinks he's being threatened and his plan is at risk, then he could activate face prematurely. We still don't know why he chose to unleash it when he did. Mest frowned. What do you mean? It's just a nagging thought, Mavis said with a shrug. But if we go over what we know, I can't see how Juoshiro could have organized more face structures to be built during the war. At the very least he must have had them prepared beforehand. So why hasn't he fired them yet? Was it because there were still Ukin on the continent? All he has to do is press a button, Ichigo pointed out. After that Ukin aren't a threat. Not when he can manifest fully without magic trying to push back. Realistically he should have won a while ago, and yet here we are now with his victory merely approaching. We saw Mimi-Heiji holding Ziref's body in the future. Do you think it's maybe a personal grudge? Possible, considered Mavis. Magic really does cherish Ziref. Far more than any other, not that he or anyone else would really consider that a good thing considering the immortality he obtained as a result of that love. But for Mimi-Heiji, who hates magic more than anything else, perhaps it was about ensuring magic's most beloved would die at his hands. For that alone, the time he'd have to wait could have become meaningless. Well, if we can disable face, then we'll at least get some breathing room. Shall we head back and find Hibiki? We hardly had the time to waste, and it might take a while to find him. You may find the landscape a bit odd. Oh yeah, remembered Mavis at Mest's words. You'll in for a treat on the way back, Ichigo. Not sure who it was, but someone really has a lot of magic to spare. Let's just say that Fiori doesn't quite look the way you remember it. Protector of the fairies. Stop him. Don't let him get Run. Just run. We can't stop him. I don't want to die. I don't want to die. I don't want to die. Please. Mercy. Hold out. He'll run out of steam eventually. Where are the mages? Why can't they stop him? August let out a sigh as he listened to the cries of hundreds of others, the temptation to use his magic to prevent the sound from reaching him growing ever stronger. He couldn't though. To do so would be the highest dishonor he could give these people, not even allowing their voices to reach him as he killed them. Such violence was never pleasant. If things could be settled through peace and diplomacy, this world would be a far better place. But he had lived long enough to know that such a world was far from becoming a reality. Their objective required something that the enemy would never give up, and to achieve their aims the only option was to use force. And while it always brought about a great loss of life, it also pathed the way to greater prosperity for all. Or at least he hoped it did. There were always those that resisted, believing that they were the ones who were right. He was hardly an exception. Alvarez's path may have been a bloody one to get where it was today, but he had still offered it, and their emperor, his loyalty. It was why he could harden his heart and take lives if it meant serving his country, just as those he fought against did the same for their home. Perhaps that was why this bothered him so much. That in the end, there was hardly any difference between the people he protected back home and the people he killed today. Raising his staff, he used it to signal ahead, the magic he wielded shaping a path for him to follow. All the enemies that stood before him quickly found the ground rising in the middle of them all before being dragged in two directions, sending what had once been a large force of soldiers into many smaller groups, all of which were being flung away. He listened carefully to the sounds they made, allowing his magic to heighten the sounds carried by the wind so to hear clearly. Carefully he let himself count them all, continuing until he heard all the soldiers hit the ground and worked out how many of them had been killed. There wasn't many, but then he hadn't wanted to. Not when their will was already so broken by the hundreds he had torn a path through so far. Glancing towards the distance, he could see the city of Magnolia beginning to appear at the edge of the horizon. The orders of Emperor Spriggan were normally clear. Magnolia must be taken in order to obtain Lumen Histo Ire. He normally wasn't one to hesitate. But something in the way the Emperor had given that order felt wrong. Like he should stop here now. Ever since that priest with the metal mask had fought with him, he hadn't been able to forget his words. He had never held any doubt in the motives of his Emperor, but since that day he had been forced to overthink every order given. If it wasn't for that priest, would he feel this unease now? Would he have been so unsettled by the grin he had seen the Emperor wear when he thought they weren't paying him any attention? If this had been any other city, he was sure he wouldn't have felt nearly this bad either. But this was the city that housed Fairy Tail, a guild that Ichigo Kurosaki had belonged to. The Emperor, for reasons he had never revealed, did not appear to like him. Before he had always assumed it was a matter of ideals, but every so often it looked personal. His Emperor was known to wander during his free time, so maybe they had met once, but he dreaded to think what kind of an encounter it had been. He shouldn't be worrying about this. The Emperor was well, he wouldn't say a good man per se. Emperor Spriggan was selfish, and certainly capable of cruelty. But he at least had vision and kindness too. The people of this city would be safe, only held as hostages to prevent further attacks. That would be the plan. So why did it feel like that Spriggan would do something else instead? Die. He flickered a finger at the soldier leaping from the walls, a slice of concentrated wind cutting him down as he leaped forward towards him. Listening carefully he could hear more of them trying to do the same, scaling the walls he had made to keep them at a distance, and so with a heavy heart he gave the order to his magic to have the walls fall to the side, crushing those climbing them as the earth become one with the ground. Was this enough yet? Perhaps one more push would break the will of these men. His staff quickly spun round, water being generated from the end and forced into a miniature whirlpool, held within the spin of his staff. As he brought the staff up, allowing the water to begin to spin, he slid his left foot along the ground and caused the earth to split all around them, forcing the soldiers into large trenches. His staff was quickly raised up higher, the water increasing vastly in volume as it began to fill the newly made channels as the men and women trapped within them desperately rushed to try and escape before the water swept them away. If it wasn't for his enhanced hearing right now from his magic, he might have missed the sound of something tearing through the air towards him. Immediately he abandoned his use of water magic and swung his staff as he spun round, deflecting the spear that had fallen from the heavens at blinding speeds, causing it to sink deep into the ground beside him. An attack from somewhere? Had they missed? No, he could hear another bit of movement. This strike was meant to kill him, but it had also been a distraction if it failed to deal the blow. He let one hand slip from his staff and swipe out at the end, unleashing a burst of fire from his hand that quickly turned into a burning inferno, causing a brief shout of surprise from the one who had intended to try and take advantage of a blind spot they believed he had. Still, whoever that person was, it was impressive that they had managed to avoid being roasted by that attack. They either had fast reflexes, hadn't underestimated him or what he was capable of, or perhaps both. The thought of it being the latter made him sigh in disappointment, knowing that if individuals capable of that were here then his day was far from over and that it would take far more to break the morale of the men and women fighting here. Is that Dash? That's him, right? He's on our side, I think. But he's... Or perhaps it wouldn't from the sound of the enemy. And for someone to produce this much uncertainty in their own allies, there were very few he could think of that would also possess the experience and power to challenge him. And only one that wielded a spear like this. Jelal Fernandez, I presume. No, it's... Wait, actually you're right, he heard the man mutter, sounded slightly surprised even. That's a change really. You know that half the idiots I've fought today kept calling me by my previous name. At least they know my reputation well enough. Miss Doggan really should have capitalized on it more. Oh. It's actual you. There was a pause briefly, and then golden light blasted through the flames and shot past him. He would have bothered defending if he had thought it was meant to be an attack of some kind, but it was only the man he was facing getting closer, resting in the air with one hand gripping his spear and carefully pulling it from the ground. "Guess the cat is out of the bag really," Jalal said, smirking all the while as he swung the now freed spear around a few times before allowing it to rest by his side, held up in the air by an aura of golden light. "When I heard my name I assumed you realized somehow, but it appears you just knew me by that name over Mistogan. Even if you went by Mistogan, I would have called you by the name of Jalal. That is the name of your true identity, regardless of what mask you wear." Jalal's grin couldn't get any wider, and his magic flared up quickly in response to the increasing golden light around Jalal. "Oh, I like you," Jalal stated, reaching out and grabbing his spear, taking a stand with it as the light around his weapon and body merged into one. "I kind of wish we weren't enemies. Unfortunately, there's an annoying part of me saying that you aren't allowed anywhere near that city, so for that reason you will be dying here. Do your best to try and defy that fate. I won't even mind if you try and run away with your tail between your legs." "Does that normally work?" he asked the former, or perhaps it was current now, dark mage. "It must be useful to have such a reputation, and to knowingly use it to your advantage too is commendable." The earth shattered around him as he began to release his usual tight hold over his magic, the wind itself picking up as the magic in the air began to come alive to his eyes. "Unfortunately, I think you'll find a reputation of that level is hardly enough to shake me. If you wish to challenge me, I shall allow it. That is the authority I have as king." "A king?" Jalal seemed to conceal his own arrogance, even as looked at him confusedly. "King of what exactly?" August merely returned a smile at that question. Truth be told, even he found it difficult to explain at times. But at its core it boiled down to something so simple, and yet so unbelievable that he found it tiring to ever explain. Sometimes actions answered this question better than anything else. His hand raised up towards Jalal, his eyes briefly shifting their gaze upwards as clouds began to gather above them. It appeared Jalal caught that little movement of his, immediately retreating back as his magic flared to life, and that action saved him from being struck by the first bolt of lightning that fell from the sky. As more lightning rained down all around them, he began to increase his pace as he let magic run through his body, strengthening his aged body and bones to allow him to freely run. Jalal immediately took to the sky, the area where he would supposedly rule, but he didn't even need to use any form of wind magic to give chase. The earth itself rose with him, a new pathway forming up and giving him all the space he needed to fight as freely as he could have on the ground. When it became apparent to Jalal that he wasn't going to be able to keep his distance, he changed tactics entirely. His first pass almost got him, the tip of the spear coming close to hitting his eye, but he took advantage of his heightened reflexes to avoid the blow, leaving only a thin cut across his cheek. He wouldn't be able to count on Jalal falling for his new speed again. The man would undoubtedly adjust his attacks for that now, but now he also had a better grasp on how fast Jalal would be coming at. It was at a speed he was not comfortably at handling easily, so when Jalal rushed at him again he forced the earth before up to rise up higher, requiring Jalal to slow down to maneuver around it. He sensed two readings as he began to move, heading towards the first. He had a vague idea of what Jalal was doing, using his weapon and controlling it remotely to launch an attack from both sides. It was hard to tell them apart from the magic alone, but he had control over plenty of other forms of magic, with many giving him the rest of the information he needed to work out which side Jalal was coming from. Magic could be faked, but life was so much harder. Lightning struck out as he extended his hand out, being released freely from the tips of his fingers and slamming straight into Jalal as he came into sight. It bought him a brief moment to deflect the spear coming from behind, knocking it against the earth wall before swiping out with his hand and causing the earth to reshape around the weapon, holding it tightly in place. Jalal tried to lunge back for it, but his hand quickly lashed back out, unleashing a storm of wind directly into the dark mage's face and knocking him straight off the side of the newly shaped plateau they had been standing in. He waited for a moment, counting out the seconds until Jalal finally showed up again. It had been longer than he had expected, and he could still see a bit of shock on Jalal's face. Had the man just noticed what he had done during this small encounter? "You know, I expected a lot from your reputation," Jalal said, looking like he was trying to act smug but was failing somewhat from having seen the sight around them. This is really something." I knew you were raising the ground, but I hadn't realized how high. Did you move the clouds too so that I wouldn't notice? If you understand all of that, please surrender, August asked calmly. I am willing to take mercy on you if you give up. Continue to fight and I won't hold back. This is holding back. Jalal asked in disbelief. Well, that makes me so happy about this then. Hey Hades. You done yet? Hades. That man was here too? His senses quickly reached out, searching for the different life signs around him by their magic, and yet found only one other. Hadn't there been hundreds more mere minutes ago? His magic quickly flared to life, teleporting him down to the ground to where there had been many enemies once. And yet now all that remained were corpses, their bodies slumped against the ground but lacking any sort of wounds that would have caused this. All that remained was the touch of a twisted type of magic. You took their lives, didn't you? He asked as he sensed the source of the other magic he had sensed approaching him. All of them. Were these not your men? And? Hades asked uncaringly. Are you expecting me to feel sorry for that? Unfortunately they had the misfortune of having you here. You're blaming me for your actions. Of course, Hades replied. Your strength is the real deal. In terms of sheer power and number of magic, I'm sure you far outstretch my own. I can hardly play fair in such cases. August couldn't withhold his fury as he turned to face Hades, his skin darkening as marks of golden light began to appear across his skin. So be it, he stated in fury, his staff shattering in his grip before he threw the remains the one side. Mercy will not be offered to you. Only death awaits. That's fine with me, Hades stated, smirking all the while as he spread out his arms and allowed chains to snake out from the sleeves of his coat. But you may have to do it a few times. I'm afraid once won't be enough to stick anymore. Fine with me, August stated, raising his hand up towards Hades before bringing it up slightly higher towards the newly made mountain behind him. How does a slow and painful one sound? His hand closed into a fist and with it the earth behind Hades shook. Realizing what was happening, Hades tried to make the first move, rushing forward and lashing out with whips of chains. August merely vanished before they could reach him, reappearing at the very bottom of the tower of earth before waving his hand against it, the earth breaking apart in the arc his path took before slowly slipping down towards them. Disappearing once more, August appeared right before Hades, a blast of wind slamming into the dark mage and pushing him back further into the path of the falling tower of earth. Chains snaked around his hand before he realized they had moved and pulled him in with Hades, dark runes forming in the dark mage's left hand before he hung them in the air like decorations, each one pulsing with dark magic. Boom. Hades' smirk spoke of his confidence, and the magic within detonated like a bomb before the two of them. With a wave of his hand all the magic parted around August, barely any damage taken due to his quick reflexes. The same was not to be said for Hades, whose face had been burned horribly by the blast. However, in a matter of seconds the flesh had already morphed back into its usual shape, a smirk present. How unfortunate. I had truly wished that you were lying, August muttered in annoyance. Hades' resurrection in the first place was an unnatural one, but the fact he was more demon than human meant he hadn't come back with just his own abilities. He had the demons too, and it appeared whatever power the demon had meant it couldn't be killed easily. There had been at least 400 people that Hades must have killed. Did that mean he needed to kill this monster 400 more times? Well, at least he didn't have to do it all himself. He merely gestured up at the falling earth, its shadow blocking out all light around them now, and used a burst of wind to loosen the chains and vanished, getting to a point far enough away to watch the impact. Unfortunately it never happened. Before the earth could hit, light danced across it from above and he saw the magic circle for a spell of destruction appear, annihilating the entire structure in one massive blast. He had almost forgotten that Jalal was present too. How to play this out? He could fight them, but could he afford to waste the time it would take? They could easily be buying time for reinforcements to arrive, unless Hades believed he could outlast him so long as he had more lives. Why not just see what outcome would happen? They were far enough away and would take a few moments to pinpoint him. For the moment he was safe, and so he allowed his eyes to close and for a new sight to appear before his eyes. They would attack. The battle would rage on for at least an hour before Jalal's magic would run dry. He would be the first to fall. Hades would continue for another 2, dragging the fight out through trickier, but would eventually use up the last of his stolen lives and die with a spike of earth planted through his heart. That was one method. The current future. But if acted in a different way, what would happen instead? If he drew them towards the city? No, he would have to abandon the fight in such a case. Not doing so would cost the entire city their lives from the dark mage Hades used. Drawing them away instead. Hades would be the first to fall ironically. Jelal would too, but his legendary spell would claim his leg, a mere annoyance with all the magic he had access to in order to regrow it, but still a painful experience to deal with. He opened his eyes once more, realizing he couldn't spend any more time looking. Whenever he channeled this power, everything flew by so fast that he had to pay extremely close attention to make out the details, and sometimes he wasn't fast enough to even realize what had happened. He had to be especially careful with his thoughts too, as even a mere idea would alter what he was seeing and render everything before it useless. And in the end he needed moments of peace to see if things had changed. All he could do was use this power to check what was going to roughly happen if he took certain actions, and even then he sometimes messed up and got the events changing anyway. But it was fine. What he had seen was enough to convince him to fight here. No reinforcements would arrive in the time it took to beat Hades. If he incorporated some of what he saw in the last vision too, he might be able to bring down the dark mage faster. Single killing blows would take too long, but attacks that would kill many times over would greatly hasten the dark mage's demise. With that in mind, he teleported and appeared right in between the two mages, both trying to reach him and being caught by surprise at his sudden appearance. Jelal reacted first, swinging the spear he thought he had trapped effectively earlier at him. He supposed the man had freed it the same way he had destroyed the mountain. Still, a wild strike like that was easy to avoid. His focus locked on Hades. His fist rose up and the ground did with him, piecing straight through Hades and launching his body flying into the air. He made quick moves to pursue, teleporting above the body and allowing a ball of magma to appear above his palm, every bit of the molten liquid being held tightly in the shape of the orb without letting a single drop escape. Burn in hell, won't you? Not giving Hades any time to react, he threw the orb of magma straight down at his body before teleporting down ahead of the attack and kicking his heel against the ground, causing it to open up until he couldn't even see the bottom. It was that very hole that he allowed Hades to fall into, his body being roasted by the hot magma as he closed the ground back up. He had seen this happen in one future. If events played out in a similar way, Hades would find a way to escape the magma, recover briefly, and then force his way back to the surface with magic. In the meantime he would try and neutralize Jelal as much as possible, to whittle down his magical power in the same way he was currently whittling down Hades' number of lives. He couldn't afford to be caught off guard, however. That thought had never been so true when he saw the form of a massive giant appear around Jelal, the man's legendary spell clear at work. Jelal crossed the distance in the blink of an eye, and a golden fist swung straight for him. Even he could only act so fast, and so the strongest defensive magic he could summon in that brief moment was shattered before it could finish being completed, his body skidding across the ground as his skin briefly flickered back to his normal state and the markings on his body dimmed. Such power from only a single blow. If he took many of those he might not be able to maintain this state. This state in the first place was very draining on magical power. He must have returned to normal in the futures he was witnessing. Still, he wouldn't be caught off guard so easily again. Already he was layering defensive magic around his body in preparation for another strike like that, and now that he had seen Jelal move once he had a good grasp of his sudden acceleration. And all I need to do to remove that advantage is to force you to continuously exhaust yourself repairing it, he muttered to himself. Let us start with dash. Something appeared in the far distance, a magical power suddenly hitting him with its weight for a brief moment, and by the time he turned his head to track it that signature was already fading. But even at a glance there were few a level of magical power of that magnitude could belong to. What was Ichigo Kurosaka doing here? Wasn't he meant to be in Alvarez? And that sensation? Had there been someone with him? The way that magical power had appeared and disappeared seemed like teleportation. You're wide open, you know. No, I'm not, August said, allowing the magic barrier around him to overlap and take the full brunt of the fist slamming against them. He turned his head towards Jelal briefly before sighing. Victory is yours today. I shall withdraw. Got somewhere you got to be. You could say that. Such a shame. But good luck at trying to run. Try, and I'll catch you. Of course stay and, well, he will. A massive chain, the width of a house, burst out of the ground behind August, splitting off at the end into hundreds of others before slamming into the ground all around them. From their source Hades slowly emerged, the chains suspending him in the air and looking like they were coming from his back from where they all snaked out. Amaterasu, Formula 100. All around August appeared the runes for the spell, Jalal recognizing them immediately as he Q and raising his own hand. Nothing personal, he said, tracing out the seals he needed urgently before the full seal for Abyss break stood between him and August. We just really need you to fall here. August glanced briefly at both spells, running through the number of spells he had capable of blocking both at once. Even before he had started looking, however, he had known there would only be one. It's come to this, he muttered, his skin shifting back to normal but letting the marks across his skin remain. With his magic focused entirely on them, they glowed brighter than ever until they let off a golden shine, the magic around him shaping just in time as the two activated their spells. When the dust from them finally settled, there was nothing left of the land where he had been standing. All that remained was a golden orb, its surface unblemished despite all the magic that hit it, and himself standing within it. I told you, August stated as the barrier slowly lowered. I will be leaving now. He turned briefly towards the two only to find Hades looking at him in pure shock, his hands falling loosely by his sides as his chains slowly lowered him towards the ground. Even that magic. What even are you? No. Who even are you? The Magic King, August spoke. Nothing more, and nothing less. But that's her magic. You're that child, aren't you? You're fighting for Lumen Histo Ire. Why? You already have it. Lumen Histo Ire. August shook his head. You think a mere human could handle it? Could take it further than this? No. All I do is imitate it. Even with all the magic I have, I'll never come close to utilizing its potential. But the shield that protects the wielder and the sight to see ahead? Those are far easier to grasp. I will say it again, August stated. I am retreating. If you wish to challenge me again, I will return in due time. Or you can chase me if you wish and meet me at the next battlefield. I will be more than happy to kill you both then. First I have some important matters to deal with. Protector of the Fairies. How are our forces doing? Our forces are beginning to slow down, Emperor Spriggan, reported the man before Zeref, kneeling before him as he gave his report. With the land's restoration, the enemy's forces have managed to regroup, though they have still been forced to retreat. We predict they will make a stand an hour from now, and that they are discarding their chances now to organize a full retreat to do this. Zeref nodded slightly, more for his own benefit than the man before. The actions Ishgar was taking were wise in such a situation. Thanks to Irene's magic, they had lost their greatest defensive, the giant barrier of fairy sphere that kept them safe. The process though had further hindered their attempts to stop them by scattering their forces and causing many to fall against the full weight of his own army, unaffected from Irene's power. However, her death had caused the opposite. When the land became what it once was, she couldn't control how and where people ended up. Most of Ishgar's forces ended up regrouping back where they had once been while his own forces had been scattered instead. It was due to their sheer numbers that had allowed that situation to remain a favorable one, but it had been close. He might have even been forced to step in himself if not for Ishgar's decision to retreat, cutting a line through his forces before they could completely encircle them and fleeing as quickly as they could. Ishgar had become too reliant on Fairies' sphere. That was the one thing that hadn't returned when Irene's magic ran its course, its structure too badly damaged by the rearranging of the world that it was unable to begin any kind of restoration process, and without it Ishgar needed time to create a new defendable point. It was merely a matter of time at this point, as more of his forces were returning while they were losing men as they tried to hold them back long enough for this. If there was any true issue his forces were finding though, it was the lack of strength in his individual forces. Irene was dead, and he had killed God Serena before he could betray him. Jin already was a lost cause now that he didn't have to play the fool, and he had already lost Di Maria, Nienhart, and Jacob in a failed attempt to whack. He only had 6 left of his original 12 mages. Those 6 weren't pushovers, they had strength in spades. But he had enough information on his enemies to know that they would struggle and were even outmatched in some cases. Envel was one such case, where his ice would fall short against the power of Delirious, housed in the body of Grey. And if it was Aziel who encountered him, he would lose in a heartbeat. Brandish meanwhile was already waving too much. She was a good soldier, but she wasn't a great one, especially when it came to listening to her heart. She did that too often, acting on her own whims, and to make matters worse, her strength, while powerful, was not one that wouldn't be able to be dealt with. In truth, his final cards to play with Alvarez were limited to a mere 3. L'arcade was special. The fact he didn't attack on a physical level with his main power meant he could handle a variety of foes. Wall meanwhile had dozens of robotic bodies to use as disposable pawns. Him being defeated was less of an issue when it meant he would come back to fight the same enemy again with even more data. But it was August that would make or break his plans right now. His greatest asset, far surpassing even God Serena when the man had been acting under his commands. Sometimes he considered it pure luck he had happened to find the man when he had. August had the capacity to rule, but had settled to serve him instead. Even if his heart wavered, he would still follow his orders to the end. That was just the kind of man August was, and how strong his loyalty to him was. It was the same reason he had entrusted him the mission of taking Magnolia in the current chaos. The other 5 Spriggan 12 members could never accomplish the task. Not if the enemy caught wind of it and sent people to stop them. But with August, it didn't matter who they sent. No one short of Anukin could stop that man when he fought seriously. To fight August was to fight magic itself. The status of the enemy mages. Even if August wasn't at risk though, he had to consider all options with his other forces. Is Ishgar still throwing wizard saints at us to stop us? He vaguely listened to the man's reply, just enough to check that he was correct. The wizard saints posed some of the greatest threats to his force's advancement, and they were rotating out wisely to keep themselves from exhausting themselves fully. When they did fight though, they didn't hold back. The terrain had already been altered several times over thanks to the work of Juranikis, and Yuryuakishihauerin was proving herself a real nuisance with the rate she was killing his men. The generals of Ishgar were provoking to be a similar menace, but the one that was causing the most problems was the one most familiar to him. Fairy Tale. He should have expected it. Out of all the mage guilds, Fairy Tale had not only the largest amount of strong mages but also the fewest casualties. If it had been them alone it still wouldn't have been enough, but when combined with the wizard saints and the generals they were capable of holding back his forces for far longer than he wished. Well, most of them at least. The dragon slayers to the west, he uttered, causing the man before him to quickly fall silent as he waited for him to finish. How are they doing? That they began processing further in. Unfortunately yes, the man reported. Their process is still slow, but our forces are finding it hard to slow them down. The one leading the charge is not human. The men are scared to face him. That would be Fairy Tale's guild master from the sound of it. Increase pressure on the men. Kill him and we can take him as a trophy to break the rest of Fairy Tale. Tell me, how many of them are there? 8 in total, including the traitor. 8 huh? 1 short. So Aknologia had returned to the land of the dead. That was one threat less to worry about, but the very thought of him made the point where his arm had been ache in phantom pain. Good. They will fall soon enough. What little magic they have recovered will not last them long. Force them to exhaust it and they will die as easily as any others. Now, what about Dash? Urgent news, Emperor Spriggan. Ziref scowled as a man shoved his way through the guards, quickly falling to his knees as he bowed down in respect. Our forces are being slaughtered from the northeast. Something is tearing its way straight towards us. Redirect one of my Spriggan 12 to deal with it. Slow the enemy's advance and take them out. We already did, sir, reported the guard, much to Ziref's surprise. Wall went to investigate and fell in battle. He informed me to alert you to the situation after he recognized the intruder and is trying to hold him off for as long as he can. Wall recognized the one responsible for this? and labeled this as urgent because of that? He could feel a pool of dread forming in his gut as he asked the question he didn't want to know the answer to. A name. Who is attacking us? It's Ishgarzichigo Kurosaka, sir. The abomination. He roared out, causing his men to rear back in fear. He paid them little mind, his mind too lost in his fury. What was the abomination doing here? He was meant to be all the way in Alvarez by now, rescuing Mavis and unaware of his current invasion. Had he left a decoy behind? He allowed his senses to reach out, briefly managing to notice the energy he viewed as so disgusting when looking closely for it. There was no doubt. The abomination was here. But, he could sense him elsewhere too, if very vaguely. This one was so much harder to sense, and he had been further away he might have not even picked it up. Further to be two readings of the same person from magic itself. Lumen histo ire, he growled out. He used it. That abomination used her power. He had to deal with this now. If the abomination was willing to use her full abilities now, there was only a small window left to stop him before everything he had built was erased with a change from the flow of time. None of his Spriggan 12 nearby could afford to go handle this, and August was too far away. It had to be him. I will go meet him myself. Inform all forces to retreat. The abomination will hesitate to strike fleeing forces without reason. Yourself, sir? But it's not dash. That is an order, he commanded, forcing the man to swallow his doubts and rush off to make preparations. This day couldn't get much worse, he believed. Hopefully though August would finish his task before it was too late. Even if he failed to kill the abomination here, it would still be worth it to say to him that his precious home had been reduced to rubble before everything was erased. Protector of the Fairies. Check the description for the links to the author.